Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is May 26th, 2021, and we are so excited to have a continuation of what I think is not only a fascinating, but also, I think, a really important series here on Mormon Stories Podcast. We have been covering a really, really important book. It's called Recovering Agency by Luna Lindsey Corbden, Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control. We're answering the sensitive and important question of either, is the Mormon Church a cult, and or, does the Mormon Church have cult-like beliefs or practices or tendencies? And if so, what are they? And if so, how can the Mormon Church learn to do and be better? Of course, no church or organization likes to be called a cult, and no cult member thinks they're in a cult or likes to be told they're in a cult. And so this is very sensitive, but the purpose is positive and constructive in that we just want the Mormon Church to harm as few people as possible. We want everyone who's ever been Mormon or will ever be Mormon to be as healthy as possible. And then everyone who has decided to change their relationship with the church and or leave it, we want them to be able to unpack and deconstruct and heal and grow. So it's all positive, all constructive. And honestly, if the Mormon Church is true and not a cult, it has nothing to fear. And if it's not true, or if it is a cult, it should be harmed. And so it's all positive. And what's equally positive is we have back with us in the studio Luna Lindsey Corbden, who is the author of this book and who has been carrying this in the series. This is part 4 of at least a 5-part series, if not more. Luna Corbden, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
It's so great to have you. I've been loving this. And a lot of our listeners have no idea we've been doing this because we've been live streaming just to Facebook because we have to release things sequentially on YouTube. And so I've been saving this all up, and we're going to have kind of a Luna Corbden week on Mormon Stories Podcast, where over 5 days we release all 5 of these episodes on YouTube. And that's going to be fun. Anyway, welcome back, Luna.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
It's been great to have you. Okay. So and I also want to welcome our listeners who are joining us on Facebook Live and eventually on YouTube as well. We welcome any questions or feedback. Please share this with as many people as possible while it's live streaming, because we love to have as many viewers as possible, and that helps us with sustainability. It helps share the healing and growth. So please share. All right, Lindsey. So we always begin kind of with an introduction. Anything you want to, should we just jump to the slides, or is there anything you want to say before we jump to the slides?
Yeah, we can jump. There's an intro slide. It kind of helps me remember who I am.
Okay. Who are you, Luna Corbden?
All right. Well, I was born in the church and was a member of the church for 26 years before I left in 2001. I worked for 14 years in the computer industry in various roles, everything from a technician support on up to sales engineer and systems engineer. I am presently a writer. I write nonfiction and fiction, including speculative fiction, science fiction, short stories, and things like that. And I'm a freelance editor and ghostwriter. And I'm LGBT. So specifically on that, I am gender fluid, which is a non-binary gender, and I'm bisexual, and I go by they, them pronouns. I'm an abuse survivor, and I currently have PTSD, and I'm autistic. I'm a psychology nerd, but I do like to tell people that I don't have a related degree in the field. I just read a lot and am interested in thinking about various topics, specifically culture and religion and manipulation and trauma and autism are kind of my focuses in that world. And I wrote a book about LDS control tactics based on the research that I'd done by other researchers who were looking specifically at cult manipulation tactics.
And I'm just going to ask all my listeners right now, please go buy this book right now. Go to Amazon or wherever this book is sold, Recovering Agency. It'll either say Luna Lindsey or Luna Lindsey Corbden. Please go purchase it. And You can buy it in audio form. You can buy it in digital form. You can buy it in paper form. But not only will this support a very important book and support Luna for writing it, but also it will help you in your life. And if nothing else, it will help you unpack your experiences. And I'll just say as a disclaimer, not only are we not, hating on the Mormon Church or targeting them, but these principles don't just apply to Mormonism. They apply to every religion, and they don't just apply to religions. They apply to unhealthy corporations, companies, businesses, multi-level marketing schemes that are unhealthy, military, government, unhealthy family systems, unhealthy relationships. The list is endless of how these principles should be applied. And so please don't think of this book as only being helpful for if you were Mormon or a member of some high demand religion.
Exactly. I've gotten feedback from people who never were LDS who read it but had similar experiences either from their own church or other societal systems that they were involved in that had similar unhealthy patterns. I also want to point people to my website because I have a lot of free resources up there as well. It's recoveringagency.com. And so I've got blog posts up there and essays and things like that can links to some videos that I've done that can help give you this information. Like if you can't afford the book, also if you can't afford the book, reach out to me and I might be able to hook you up with something. As I want this to be out there and I want people to grow from it and learn from it. More than I want the money, to be honest. So
I love it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Luna, for joining us. Thanks for doing this series. And this slide's great because it shows us not only what we've covered, but what we're going to cover today. And it also shows us what we're going to be covering in our fifth and final episode.
Yeah, we're halfway there. Living on a prayer.
Whoa, living on a prayer. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So we've already covered. I'll read them really fast. All the ones in light blue. So we've already covered love bombing, destabilization, deception, sacred science, mystical manipulation, milieu control, demand for purity, doctrine over self, loading the language, totalist reframing, thought terminating cliches, belief follows behavior, public commitment, creating dependency, black and white thinking, emotion over intellect, time control, blame reversal, and guilt and shame. And today we will be covering dispensing of existence, social pressure, elitism, us versus them thinking, the double bind, and confession.
And just to help our listeners or viewers who are joining us for the first time kind of get some context, Luna developed or identified 31 techniques or teachings or approaches or tools used by abusive or high demand or unhealthy organizations. You could say cults if you wanted to. And 31 of them, Luna refers to them as kind of the 31 flavors of coercion or undue influence or mind control. There are lots of different ways to look at this. Mm-hmm. We've covered about 18 or 19 of them so far. We're going to be covering 6 of them today, and we've got a few more to cover in our last episode. So this is, again, a 5-part series, and today we're on part 4.
Yep. And just for credibility's sake, I didn't invent any of these or discovered them. Some of them didn't have names when I came across them in the literature, but I have seen all of these described by other writers, almost all of them never Mormon, never dealt with Mormonism. These are people going back to the 50s who originally started in studying prisoners of war, returning from communist re-education camps or prisoners of war camps, going through all of the new religious movements in the 60s. That's kind of where this field started. And most of these already were named and spelled out, but they weren't collected into one place. And some of them weren't necessarily named, but the dynamic was described. And so a couple of them I gave a name, but I'm still sourcing materials. And then one of them, the double bind, was actually best described by an ex-Mormon author, Marian Stricker. And so we'll be talking about that one today. So that is kind of the only one where my main source is Mormon related, but most of these are they had nothing to do with Mormonism when they were describing these topics.
Right.
Yeah.
A couple just quick comments from our listeners. Tara writes, I'm so thrilled about this series. I found Luna's book incredibly insightful and validating, so valuable for your listeners. Marcelo writes, the book is awesome. Hey, Marcelo. And then, of course, BJ writes, Luna's book really helped me to deprogram when I left. It really helped to know what the church did to me. And thank you, all of our listeners and viewers.
BJ, by the way, is the narrator on the audiobook.
Oh, that's great.
Great job.
Thanks, BJ. Amazing. Shout out to BJ and Marcelo and Tara. All right, let's dive in, Luna.
All right, let's go.
What's our first one for today?
We're going to start with social pressure. We already talked about a couple of these mechanisms under love bombing
and milieu control, I'm guessing.
We talked about it a little bit in milieu control as well. This is focused, love bombing was focused on how social pressure is used to bring people into the church. And this part is focused on how social pressure is used to keep people in the church and keep people obeying while they're in the church.
Okay.
And so it accomplishes a number of things. It influences people via culture rather than dictated down from on high, which offers a number of benefits for a totalitarian or totalistic leader, because then they can say, well, I never said that, but really the pressure is still there to do it. It creates a subtle yet powerful reward and punishment system. So, if you were to flog people openly, then it would be pretty obvious that there's something wrong and you might get law enforcement breathing down your neck. But if you can get people to pressure each other in social ways and threaten ostracization or give, disapproving looks and things like that, that can hurt just as bad. It can hit us just as hard, but it's less obvious. It reinforces most of the other control techniques. Those are all conveyed and doubled down on via social pressure. It reinforces our dependency on such a group. It reinforces the doctrines that the group is hoping to teach us. So it's not just some person on a pulpit telling us these things, but our society all around us is also telling us these things. So it's harder to point to it and say, oh, that isn't true when everyone thinks it's true. It prompts the mimicking of behavior. And as we discussed in Belief Follows Behavior, when you behave a certain way and you don't understand why, you often resolve that to, okay, it must be because I believe everything that is behind my behavior. And it pressures you to filter your own personal self-expression.
Yeah. I feel like this is one of the most powerful of all the tools that is
it's hard to pick a most powerful one, right? They're all really, really powerful.
But this one is super powerful.
Yeah. So, and it's pollen season, so I'm sorry, but my nose is running.
No worries at all.
I try to be perfect because I was raised to be a perfectionist.
Well, no, as you're doing that, no, it's okay. I'll just fill in and just say that I believe that religious conversion is primarily an emotional and a social conversion, not an intellectual one. And maintenance of religious participation is, in my view, primarily social. Mm-hmm. And then the biggest obstacles or difficulties in leaving a religion are social, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah. And being on the autism spectrum, I've had to my relationship to social stuff has been quite a bit different than a typical neurotypical person. And so for a lot of the social stuff, the levers didn't work as well on me. And, I didn't make friends easily within the church, and it was a real struggle. And so a lot of the social pressures, they didn't work as well on me. Or like even as a teenager, when it was the other way around, when all of my peers were like sneaking around, getting around all the rules and stuff, I was the judgmental one. I've always been kind of like different from everyone else, even when I was the one doing the judging. So it's kind of funny. Just letting people know it's this stuff. The social side of things doesn't necessarily come instinctively to me, but on the upside of that, it means I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm analyzing it. I'm able to sort of step outside what other people are doing just as a knee-jerk reaction and observe it as an observer, as an analytical observer. So that's kind of my point of view and where I'm coming from.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got
a slide here with a bunch of fish.
Mm-hmm. A little goldfish.
I thought the sheep or the lamb metaphor would work as well.
That's right. Well, these are, I find these pictures on Google and I have to use them. So this is a little goldfish, and then there's a blue goldfish that's swimming the other way. And like the crackers, the goldfish. So we talked a little bit about social proof under love bombing and I think milieu control. And that is the tendency that we all have to think that whatever whatever everyone else is doing is right. And usually that's true. So the example I like to use is when you show up at a concert and the parking lot is jam-packed and you don't know which direction the entrance is, and you look around and there's a group of people and they're headed that way and you follow them. Like, most of the time, it's smart to follow what other people are doing, because most of the time other people are actually more correct when you don't know. When you already know and you're going with the crowd against what you know, then that's a different situation. But when you don't know, we tend to look to the crowd. But the danger of that is when the crowd is wrong, you end up with what's called pluralistic ignorance. And that's where you have 10 people in a group and one person thinks that's wrong. And the person sitting next to them thinks that's wrong. And the person sitting next to them thinks that's wrong. And all 10 people are thinking that it's wrong, but no one wants to say it because they think that the other 9 all think that it's right. So that's called pluralistic ignorance. And when I left the church and started meeting other ex-Mormons, now we're free to talk about the stuff we never could talk about. I suddenly discovered a lot of people saying, yeah, I was sitting there in church thinking that's wrong. And the other person was like, I was too. And all of a sudden we all come out of the woodwork. We were there all along, but no one was willing to point it out while we were in the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's the idea of people, the herd mentality, right? Of you're following the herd, and then sometimes the herd goes off the cliff and you risk following everybody off the cliff, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You have to guard against that. It's groupthink. Groupthink.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is true.
I love the Asch conformity experiment, as someone, who's trained in psychology. This is like one of the top 5 coolest social science experiments of all time. So tell us what it is.
And it managed to be ethical. So many of the most famous experiments from that time period were completely unethical and like appalling in terms of what they did to people. But this one was actually ethical. So what they did, the Asch conformity experiment. So Solomon Asch is the scientist who did this study. And he brought in, filled a room with 8 people. And only one of those 8 people was the actual scientific subject, and the other 7 were accomplices. They were actors who were in on the experiment, but the subject thought that they were all in on the experiment, that they were all subjects of the experiment.
They're also called confederates, right? Is that another word for it?
Confederates. Yep. And so they put up a chart, and the chart has 3 lines, A, B, and C, and they're all different lengths. And then it has another line off to the side that is X. And X is supposed to be the same length of one of the other 3 lines. And then they go around the room and they ask everybody, which one do you think X is the same length of? They go around the room. Now they do a couple of times where everybody's right. Everybody says X is the same length as B in the example in the slide. And so the subject starts to think, okay, everybody's probably right here. But then they go around and everybody says A. Well, if you look at the slide, if you can see the slide, A is quite a bit longer than X. So they go around, number 1 says it's A, number 2 says it's A. They get around to the actual subject, who's the last one in line, and 3 out of 4 times, the person is going to go with the crowd and say the wrong length. My cat is coming in.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Sorry. And so they go around the room, and 3 out of 4 times, the person will comply with what they think the crowd is going with, as opposed to sticking up for themselves.
Now, just to restate so that everyone understands, because some people aren't going to be able to see this visually. Right. So the group, aside from the one person being studied, the group is told beforehand to give the wrong answer, to say that 2 lines that actually aren't the same height are, to see what happens to the subject if a bunch of people before them give the wrong answer. Will they give what is obviously the right answer, or will they cave to social pressure that's been expressed before and give the answer that the group is giving? That's the test, right?
Exactly.
And you're saying 3 out of 4 times the subject will go with the group and knowingly give the wrong answer in response to peer pressure.
Exactly. In fact, they end up sort of feeling like it is the right answer. They feel like something's wrong with them. And
they must have saw it wrong, or, they must be missing something.
Exactly. And I can relate to that feeling. Like when everybody else is saying something and I'm not, I'm kind of like, But again, being on the autism spectrum, I've always been the most likely one to be like, you know what, that's wrong. I'm going with what I think.
Yeah.
So what's funny is that they did all kinds of variations on this experiment to sort of suss out what certain common factors were. And one of the twists that Solomon Asch did was they had one other person among the 8 give the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that when even just one other person gives the right answer over all the wrong ones, then the subject is actually far more likely to go along with the right answer, because now there's at least one other person that's supporting them. But if that person leaves the room before it comes around to them, then they go back to giving the wrong answer with the crowd.
Which is what's behind Mormon Stories podcast, letting people tell their stories so that others know they're not alone. And this is why people coming out, not everyone is safe enough to come out. Not everyone's in a privileged position to be able to come out as having lost their faith, or as transgender, or as gay or lesbian, or as a feminist, or whatever, the going against the grain thing might be. Mm-hmm. But when one person does speak up and speak out, it makes it easier for other people to be able to do that as well. It's an act of courage.
It definitely
Speaking
does.
up is an act of courage.
And it explains why the church fights so hard for Malou control, which is one of the techniques we talked about before. They fight so hard to make sure that everyone at church who's getting up there with the microphone at testimony meeting and talking to each other in the hallways, they want to make sure that it is 100% unanimous story that everyone is telling. Because if even one person comes out and says something different, then that breaks the pluralistic ignorance illusion that is set up. And more people will be like, yeah, I think you might be right about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should also mention, do you ever talk about the obedience to authority experiment in your book, or in this
I do in the book.
Release?
I don't get to it in the presentation. It's sort of, the presentation is focused on the 31 techniques. My book has an opening section that talks a little bit more about the more general human tendencies. And it's because the presentation's going so long as it is, I kind of had to pick and choose. So I don't talk about the authority experiments. But Milgram is pretty big on that list.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to say, listeners, one other huge study that everyone should know about is the Stanley Milgram obedience to authority experiment, where you find, basically, I'll summarize that if someone is wielding authority over you and kind of pressuring you in a position of authority, 2 out of 3 times you're likely to do kind of potentially really awful things.
Right. That's one of the ones that was unethical. Because it actually traumatized people to have to experience that experiment. So that's a little teaser trailer. If you want to know, go to Wikipedia about Milgram's experiment, or my book discusses it as well.
I love it. All right. So the Asch conformity experiment is a classic.
Sure is.
And so what is it? So you have some examples now.
Well, first of all, I have some of the literature just to show that I'm not just making this stuff up. Yeah. And so I have a couple of points conveyed by this literature. One of them is that very complex messages can be conveyed without words, especially in a high pressure situation where you're, waiting every second, looking to make sure you're doing the right thing, which is kind of what is created in some of these totalistic groups. And so John D. Goldhammer, in his book Under the Influence, says the raised eyebrows, a certain expression, are all we need to immediately know we have deviated from the collective norm. Any feelings or thoughts that are not in alignment with our social group are censored and repressed. Like a child who becomes acutely aware of a parent's disapproving glance, we are taught to repress unacceptable behavior, ideas, and language.
So it's just like a huge percentage of communication isn't verbal, it's body language.
It's
a huge percentage of social pressure does not need to be verbal, explicit pressure. It can be eyebrows, it can be heads nodding in affirmation or in disagreement. It can be scowls, distancing. There are all sorts of
different tones of voice, the way people treat you. Yeah, you pick up. We're wired as social animals to pick up on the slightest little hint of what the people around us want and need. And that's a survival tactic that our species has been very successful for our species, incredibly successful, but it can be misused by abusive people who want to get what they want, exploit people for what they want.
Yeah. Love it. Okay.
Yep. So this quote is by Margaret Thaler Singer from Cults in Our Midst. She's one of the earliest cult researchers studying those prisoners of war coming out of Korea, communist prisoner well, they called it brainwashing. I try to avoid the word now because it's fallen out of favor. But anyway, so she says, approval comes from having your behaviors and thought patterns conform to the models put forth by the group. Your relationship with peers is threatened whenever you fail to learn or display new behaviors. Over time, an easy solution to the insecurity generated by the difficulties of learning in the new system is to inhibit any display of doubt, and even if you don't understand the content, to merely acquiesce, affirm, and act as if you do understand and accept the new philosophy or content. So that's what happens when we're put under social pressure and we don't fully understand what's going on, and we just immediately we act like we do. And of course, when we studied belief follows behavior, we learned that when you act like you do, you end up believing like you do.
Absolutely. And I think you have some examples of this later.
Yeah. So next one, this is a quote by Robert Cialdini from his book, Influence, Science and Practice. And the point he's making here is that social pressure allows leadership to delegate manipulation. So he's talking about Jim Jones. Jim Jones, who ran the People's Temple, which is where the 900 and some odd people were massacred or killed themselves under his direction. Jim Jones's real genius as a leader was his realization of the limitations of individual leadership. No leader can hope to persuade regularly and single-handedly all the members of the group. A forceful leader can reasonably expect, however, to persuade some sizable proportion of group members. Then the raw information that a substantial number of group members has been convinced of can, by itself, convince the rest.
Yeah, it's much more effective if you want to have high control over your organization to have people under you enforcing the rules versus you having to enforce the rules yourself.
Exactly.
Then you can be the good guy. You can stay pure. If mistakes, this is why the Mormon Church is really insistent that bishops and stake presidents, excommunicate people, not the church leaders. It's plausible deniability. It saves them time. It lets other people do the dirty work. If mistakes happen, again, it's the local mistake. There's no legal liability, less legal liability up top. There are all sorts of reasons why you want to push down responsibility to your membership.
Yeah,
but it's also more effective. It's more effective.
It is because you trust the people. I think I make that point in a little bit, that you trust the people around you. These are your family members, your friends, they're local people. They understand local issues. And so you're going to trust them more than you will trust some old guy in Salt Lake City.
Right.
Yeah, it's another reason.
Absolutely.
So, that's the next slide, actually. We tend to trust our friends and family more than higher up leaders. And Boyd K. Packer shows us this. He says, I have that certain witness. It came to me in my youth. During those early periods of doubt, I leaned on the testimony of a seminary teacher. Although I did not know, somehow I knew that he knew. So,
and of course, the implication is believe Boyd K. Packer, believe your seminary teacher, believe your bishop, believe your young women's leader, believe the apostles, believe people general conference. And then if you start saying something enough and doing something enough, and we've covered this in previous episodes, you'll start believing it yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
So what happens is, and we talked about this before, cognitive dissonance, which is that uncomfortable feeling we get when we encounter information that goes against our pre-existing beliefs. Cognitive dissonance says, I don't believe this. It also says, but I want to belong. And those two feelings are clashing in your mind. And so what's the easiest resolution to that? If I do what they do and believe what they believe, then I will resolve the I don't believe part and feel comfortable.
Yeah. And I would just say, Luna, I'm guessing you'd agree with this, that for millennia, I think this behavior evolved in us for survival's sake. There's this saying, a lone monkey is a dead monkey. In other words, we needed historically our social groups to survive. And I still think we are social creatures primarily, maybe not everyone to the same level, but I think basically speaking, we survive and thrive in groups. Like someone once said, it can take a village to raise a kid. And so it's probably on some level adaptive to follow the crowd. But there are risks to it. And then the only other thing I'll say is that in 2021, what's a privilege or a benefit is we're able to form new groups like never before, such that if the mainstream religious group or social group ends up rejecting us or we choose to leave it, it's a privilege in the modern age to be able to say, okay, I can't be a member of X group anymore, but I can be a member of Y group, or I can form group Z of people who I fit with better. And that's why we're talking about this, is because it's a privilege. In some ways, a faith transition is a privilege.
Absolutely. And we all, social media has been amazing. I've grown up with it. I had my first computer when I was 9, earlier than most of my peers, and was on the internet when I was 16. Well, the BBSs, which were like the internet. And then I was on the internet right away in 1995, as soon as it was commercially available. And so like I've watched the change of society and our ability to socialize across regional lines. I mean, the fact that the listeners here are from all over the world, we wouldn't have been able to do this 20 or 40 years ago at all. And so it's a tremendous privilege. And the thing is evolution doesn't care about your feelings. Evolution isn't there to make the perfect species. Evolution, that would imply some kind of intelligence. The point of evolution is survival, survive and propagate. That is it. And so these techniques have been in use for thousands and thousands of years. They have helped our species survive, but it hasn't necessarily been that great for a lot of people in those societies. The people on the lower end, the people who didn't have power, they were the ones being suppressed and rejected and having their beliefs squashed out. And we have the most amazing, like even before the internet, just the fact that we had books and we could spread our ideas and read the ideas of different people itself is a development. And all of these mind control techniques we're talking about have actually developed in the last, a lot of them have developed the way they are in particular in the last 200 years or so, because the ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of press and all of that are, depending on which culture you're talking about, somewhat new. And so the fact is that manipulative and controlling people couldn't just go out with their weapons and round up a bunch of people and force them to convert like in the past. They've had to use more sneaky methods, and that made social pressure a much more important tool for them, as opposed to just, using physical coercion to get people to do what they wanted.
I love it. Okay. Yeah. So social pressure can make us override our own concerns and questions and doubts and skepticism to belong.
Yes, it can. So on the next slide, we have a quote by Singer and Ofshe. This is Margaret Thaler, Singer, and I think Richard Ofshe. And they are talking about communist peer influence on Chinese students. And they found out that it was more effective than the prisoners of war who had been tortured and brainwashed. So they're talking about the Chinese students. It says, in these programs, it appears that aversion arousal, which is guilt and anxiety, coupled with peer rejection, became the driving force through which the target was coerced. Social and psychological punishment by peers became the workhorse of the system. For many individuals, this process induced psychological breakdown. And so that leads us to, we were talking last time about destabilization. And so when you have all of these people pressuring you all around you and other pressures that they were using at the time, you can actually just break down, and then they have the opportunity to build you back up in their image.
I love it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. This has been studied well.
Yes. So on the next slide.
And just more effective than torture and brainwashing is it's saying a lot. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, because when the cognitive dissonance, when you're being forced like physically to do something under duress, your cognitive dissonance is going to align with, okay, I'm doing this because I have to, or I'll die, or my family will die, or I'll be in pain. And so you can then lie without it changing your beliefs, because you have a good reason. You feel like you have a good reason for lying. When it's social pressure, you can't see that. You don't know where that feeling is coming from. And that's when you're more likely to go with the group, because there's nothing to resolve. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quick comment from a listener. Neil writes, "Oh man, my head aches from how much I relate to this stuff." Glad you're joining us, Neil. Glad it's resonating.
Yeah. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah. So let's go to some brain scans.
All right, we've already talked about these brain scans, so I made the slide real small because I already mentioned it. But just to point out, social pressure creates a milieu where everyone agrees or seems to agree with each other. The false unanimity immerses the member in consonance, so they have this comfortable feeling that they can go to whenever they want to, and their only other choice is social rejection feels like pain. And we did discuss this. The slide shows brain scans of brain. The top row are brains that were under physical pain, and the bottom are brains that are under rejection, which I think they asked the person to recall a time they were broken up with or rejected, and they point to the same areas of the brain. And so we feel social rejection as the same way we feel pain, and so we're going to try to avoid it the same way we'll avoid pain. And that saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is complete crap. It's complete crap. Words can hurt you so bad. They can drive a person to feel like they don't want to live on the earth anymore. And I can speak from experience from that. Words can make that happen. Whereas sticks and stones, that'll heal a lot faster than psychological damage.
Yeah, and I've already mentioned this as well, but the study out of San Francisco State University, the Family Acceptance Project with Caitlin Ryan, teased out what factors contribute to LGBT suicides, deaths by suicides, and it's family rejection. When a youth is highly rejected by their family member, they're 3 times more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, 3 times more likely to engage in risky drug behavior, and 8 times more likely to attempt death by suicide. And it's family rejection that is what causes it. And that's not an LGBTQ thing. That's just a life thing.
Everybody.
You reject your kids, they're going to be more likely to die early. Just plain and simple. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
So on the next slide, well, you led in great to that, because I want to point out that there are people who fit into Mormonism pretty well. Those are the life choices they would probably already be making. They want a suburban family. They want medium income. They want to live a very strict Puritan kind of life. They don't have a lot of it. They like cute little piano music, and they like the kind of church meetings, the socialization that they get. They like wearing suits or dresses, and those people are going to fit within Mormonism really, really well, and they're going to be very, very comfortable. Then there's the square pegs, and I think I was definitely one of those. I have a list of people who might count as a square peg, people for whom the church doesn't fit very well. That might be non-white or ethnically diverse people from other countries, LGBTQIA, introverts or people with social anxiety, anyone who's gender nonconforming, and I'm not just including trans people in that. I'm including cis women who are strong and want a career, or cis men who are nurturing and love children and like to raise children. Includes autistic and neurodiverse people, nonconforming artists, so artists who want to do wild and outlandish and socially challenging and very emotionally powerful pieces, rather than the gentle landscapes and biblical scenery that we're used to from Mormonism. Free spirits, intellectuals, progressives, single parents. I was one of those, so it's really hard to fit in the church if you're a single parent. And fans of blue Jello. Just have my little joke there. And I have a quote from Kent Ponder, who wrote there's an internet essay called Mormon, it might be a paper, I don't know the difference between a paper and an essay sometimes, but it's called Mormon Women, Prozac and Therapy from 2003. I think it's still online. And he says, if a church's belief shoes are all narrow, even though they may vary in length, which women will think this works? Those with narrow feet, of course. They will benefit. Those with wide feet will be in pain and wondering why. When bishoprics and therapists have strong religious conviction that narrow shoes are God's only true shoes, they offer corn and bunion pads to pained women with wide feet.
Powerful. For our listeners who don't get the reference, we have a lot of non-Mormon listeners. Jello has historically been a Mormon cultural staple, and green Jello, for some reason, has been adopted within Utah historically as being the preferred flavor of Jello. And so that's the joke of the blue Jello. And I'm just going to add just really quickly that what's ironic about this list is that this list talks about all the people on the margins, right?
Mhm.
And ironically, Jesus, the founder of Christianity, that was a very important thing to Jesus. The leave the 99 to go after and save the one sort of message, that the one matters and that the group's interest should not railroad or harm the individual of the needs or the desires of the individual. That was core to Jesus's message. But ironically, any religion, not just Mormonism, but any Christian religion and any non-Christian religion, once it becomes a corporation, a structure, an organization, it almost immediately becomes more concerned, as it probably should, with its own survival, with its own needs, with its own interests, and almost without fail, organizations end up stepping on and squelching the needs of the individuals. And I'm only bringing that up because it's particularly ironic or tragic within a Christian paradigm, because that just without exception violates one of the core tenets of Christianity, or of Christ, who is the founder of the religion. So when the Mormon Church is just like, oh, I guess there's going to be LGBTQ deaths and suicides, or I guess we'll lose intellectuals or feminists from the church because they're the great enemies of the church, or, oh, we don't really care about, neurodiverse or artists or free spirits because they can't, oh, they're wearing tattoos, or they've got multiple ear piercings, or they're not dressing in a white shirt. Anytime there's conformity and groupthink and preference of the group over individual, which is one of your 31 points, right? Isn't it? Organization over individual, or what is it?
Doctrine over self. Mm-hmm.
Doctrine over self. Yeah. It's always ironic and tragic within a Christian paradigm.
And Jesus said, if you have done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. And if you want a list of the least of these in Mormon society, I just put one up there. So
Yeah. If you're harming these people and you're a Christian, then you're harming Jesus and God.
Yeah.
There's no other way to look at it.
That's what he said.
Yeah, that's a great slide. Okay.
Thanks. So here's a few quotes from the Mormon context from the Strength of Youth pamphlet in 2011. It said, "What is the definition of a friend? Friends are people who make it easier to live the gospel of Jesus Christ." I'm a little appalled at that quote because that's not what true friendship is. There are whole books and poems and stuff written about what true friendship is, but true friendship is not the person who's going to keep you always putting an organization over yourself.
Yeah, it's also really limiting. A friend is someone that always agrees with me on everything, and it's not even agrees with me. It agrees with a third-party organization that is pretending to have your best interests at heart. But in reality, the corporation has its own best interests at heart. So this is a very self-serving quote for the organization to say, only surround yourself with people who support the organization. And that's also, that's in many of the 31 flavors or techniques that you've highlighted.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is from a study done by Dr. Christine J. Doughty from UVU. And it was a paper called Cultural Considerations for Social Work with Mormon Women Diagnosed with Depression. And this is a case study, a person named Tracy. And Tracy says, "I feel like everything is judgmental. I have never seen people judge so harshly on clothing, hair, the things that others are doing, that that's what Utah is. I don't get it. What's wrong with me? What am I doing so wrong? For some reason, people just judge me really harshly. I don't know why. I have just come to the conclusion that it's Utah and I hate it here." And you notice that Tracy, I think Tracy's a woman. I think she's saying, what's wrong with me? And that's what happens in these situations. We see everybody else doing the same thing, and then they're looking at us side eye, and we're like, what did I do? And we think, and again, as an autistic person, that's probably going to come out a lot today. We're talking about social stuff. A person, I have empathy, I have compassion for people, I want to please people, but I don't always take in all of the information and sort it out correctly in my mind. So since I was a child, I just know that people randomly don't like me. That I say stuff sometimes that people don't get or something. And so I go through life feeling misunderstood. And until I got my autism diagnosis, I thought there was something like wrong with me, that I didn't understand why people were treating me the way they were. I didn't stop to think, well, first of all, maybe I'm just a little different. Maybe it's not wrong. I'm just different. And maybe they're wrong for not taking the time to understand me better and what I actually meant by things.
Yeah.
So, and that's taken a lot of work, and that will take a lot of work for people, because it is our instinctive response to turn that inward, when really sometimes we ought to be turning it outward.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then from a memoir from an ex-Mormon, called Suddenly Strangers, Brad L. Morin says, while greatly concerned about the infectious influence of others' lifestyles upon our children, we frequently seemed oblivious to the highly contagious nature of our own intolerance.
Yeah, we can definitely be super intolerant.
Mm-hmm. So what's the remedy? So that's the next
remedy?
slide.
Yeah, I love it that you've got remedies in here.
I wish I had more. I realize I only did it on like a few of them. So
we'll take them where we can get them.
All right. So the remedy for this one is, first of all, become self-aware as you can. I recommend that anyway. It's a wonderful life skill. It's impossible to ever fully complete. And there are philosophers that talk about that. They're really interesting to think about, but learn as much about yourself and learn how to listen to your inner self as you can. I have a couple of questions on the list that might help with that. What do you love most about yourself? What would you change about yourself? Not from outside pressure, but from your own heart. And what are your values? And I have a couple of resources up there for exploring your values. We're used to, from Mormonism, having our values dictated to us, and this idea that there is one set of values that everyone must follow. And while I agree that we should all have the value not to hurt each other, I think that there's a lot of variance in terms of what the other values that we have are. A value is the thing that is important enough to you that you actually act on it. A value isn't something that you say, oh, I'm really into honesty, and then you go and turn around and lie a lot. I mean, sometimes you can break your values every once in a while, but if you're making a habit of breaking your value, it's not really a value. And so explore that space. Explore what you really spend your time on, what you really enjoy, what sparks joy in yourself. A couple of resources. There's a couple of decks of cards. And there's a link in the slides if you want to take a screenshot or come back to it. That's a list of value cards. And the idea is you print them out and cut them up into pieces, and then you can grab them based on what you feel. So I feel I really like spontaneity and creativity and friendship, and you can lay those out. And here's the ones I don't feel, and it can kind of help you get an idea of who you are. And there's another one, my therapist used this deck with me. They're called the Mixed Emotions Oracle Cards by Petra Martin and Chris Wiltza. And those have art. It's the same idea. It's emotions are often values. So most of them can be exchanged for values, but they have art on them. So there's an emotion with them. My therapist had me just go through the deck and just on a spur of a moment, put the ones that I resonated with in a pile. And then we spread the pile out, and I could get like a really good, and I had some surprises about things that I valued based on how I felt about them and the way I spent my time. So that's a good start to just learn who you are. And then you can take social feedback and you have something to compare it with and make conscious decisions about the choices that you make in life. Also, I recommend you gain confidence. You have a right to your own thoughts, preferences, and values. And learn how to set boundaries. That is way outside the scope of this presentation, even just the definition of what a boundary is. But there's all kinds of stuff written about it, and therapists are usually well-versed on what a boundary is. It's important to set internal boundaries, which are the rules that you have for yourself and your own behavior. I will not, do this, or I will not do that. And then there's external boundaries, which is how you allow others to treat you. And this isn't like, I want you to buy me dinner every week. That's not a boundary. That's a preference and a request. A boundary is like, don't yell in my presence. Please don't yell in my presence, or I will have to not hang out with you anymore. It's things that people do to you, and it's drawing a line and saying, don't do that to me. Other than that, lots of other resources out there on how to set boundaries. But I highly recommend exploring that.
I also just want to say that, ironically, this is highly consistent with not just Mormonism, but with so many of the other predominant faith traditions. Whether it's, ancient Greek saying, know thyself, or even Jesus saying the kingdom of God is within you. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of these spiritual practices, is self-awareness, self-knowledge. And ironically, as soon as an organization or a church or a corporation gets built up, all of a sudden their main focus is to not have you self-develop, but instead to figure out what the doctrine, the teachings, the practices, the preferences, the behaviors that benefit the organization. And you're constantly trying to deny and ignore and suppress your own self-understanding and your own self-interests.
Which is abuse.
And so it's abuse.
In this day and age, that's straight up abuse.
Yeah. And that's why, ironically, this is highly, highly compatible with Christianity in its pure sense. Yeah. All right. So that's number one for today. That is social pressure. On to number two, which is elitism. And I'll just have to say, obviously, I've been given a grade on most of these. Mormonism is highly social, and Mormonism gets an A+ on the use of social pressures to educate and to keep its members bound. And if you don't believe me, just try and speak up in a testimony meeting, say something unapproved, teach a lesson that's unapproved, start a podcast that's unapproved, start a YouTube channel or a TikTok channel that's unapproved, do anything publicly that's unapproved, or just try and leave the church and see what happens with your parents, with your siblings, with your, social groups. We're just punished socially in every possible way.
Yeah.
On average. There's going to be exceptions, but on average.
Pretty much. Yeah. I was an exception kind of because I already had non-member friends and not a whole lot of friends in the church. So it was easy for me to walk away. But yeah, and I didn't live in Utah. So that's the only reason I was an exception. And even then I've gotten tons of negative social feedback. So yeah. For doing so.
All right. Yeah. So elitism is the next tool or flavor or technique.
It sure is. So a lot of these techniques cause a lot of negative emotions, shame and guilt and doctrine over self. You kind of like, after love bombing, why would you stay in a group that's treating you like this? And that's kind of what the whole theme of this whole group of presentations is why would you stay in? And so one of the carrots that they offer you, one of the good little upsides that they give you is elitism, which says that the group and its members are the very best. And it acknowledges, sure, everybody's equal, but we're the really best. We're actually the best. And I just mentioned that. So elitism boosts you up after tearing you down. I think the military uses this as well. But it's contingent upon group approval. So you get this sense of euphoria and pride, like I'm special, I'm a peculiar person, and I'm a member of God's chosen people, but only as long as you continue to toe the line and everyone sees you towing the line and approves of you. It builds a strong group cohesion. So it reinforces that social pressure. And it also reinforces us versus them, which is we're going to be talking about. I think it's the next one. It makes members feel like they're valued, but only through the group. And it supplants the self-image with the group image. We've talked about how the group creates a pseudo-personality, which is part you, part the group. And elitism is kind of part of the incentive to get you to replace your personality with the group's personality.
And we'll talk about some of these, but what comes up for me immediately in a Mormon context, there's just the teaching of the chosen people. So just the fact some people don't think about this, but I've talked to Jews who even believe that this idea that the Jews were God's chosen people, that's fundamentally racist. But this idea of the pure blood of Israel, the talk of blood and inheritance and the chosen, that's us versus them. So it's baked into the Old Testament, which then carries through to the New Testament.
The Book of Mormon. All throughout the Book of Mormon.
What's that?
It's all throughout the Book of Mormon.
And then the Book of Mormon is all about the 12 tribes and the grafting and the olive branches and the pure blood.
Versus the Lamanites. And this time the Lamanites are the good guys. Now the Nephites are, oh no, how could the Nephites possibly fall into sin? Yeah, the whole thing.
And there's Gentiles and the chosen, and then the Gentiles are going to help resuscitate the fallen pure blood. It's just a total mess. But it's all us versus them. And you can't have religion without it. And we're just talking about 1% of it. And then, modern day examples, I'm just thinking of patriarchal blessings. They make you feel special just being a member. This idea of Saturday's Warrior, the chosen generation, just the fact, what Mormon youth group wasn't told that they were part of the chosen generation, save for the last days to help usher in the millennium. And by the way, every teenage generation has been told that since the beginning of Mormonism. And it's all about this us them elitist kind of mindset and mentality.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
You just covering the whole thing right there. We're gonna get through it fast then. Elitism is an extension of sacred science, and part of sacred science is saying that this is the one true system. This is the truth. And so if the group is special, then so are the members. A couple of quotes from the cult research literature. Yanya Lalich and Michael Lagoni in Cults 101, a checklist of cult characteristics. You can find this online. One of the bullet points there is the group is elitist, claiming special, exalted status for itself, its leadership, or its leaders and members. I love they use the word exalted there. Again, I don't think either of these two had really ever considered Mormonism before writing that famous checklist. And yet there's that word exalted. John D. Goldhammer in Under the Influence said, the individual members of a group so completely identify with the collective mission that they too experience tremendous ego inflation, viewing themselves through their association with the group as anointed persons, uniquely gifted and appointed as emissaries of a world-saving cause, which, of course, all others must be converted to.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, I've already said it, but patriarchal blessing, there's the declaration of lineage. Why was that tradition even included? It's basically to say you are even if you're adopted into a chosen lineage, it's all about privilege, elitism, us versus them.
Feeling better than everybody else. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
John D. Goldhammer also said a destructive group directly erodes the individual's self-esteem and sense of worth, while at the same time paradoxically maintaining the illusion of elitism and superiority. Persons trapped in this dynamic derive their self-worth and sense of identity from a group and their position within the group. So that carrot and stick feeling that I'm worthless, I am worth everything, back and forth, is actually part of the design. And as an abuse survivor, I can say that definitely happened to me as well within a personal relationship, where one minute I'm at top of the world and next minute I'm persona non grata and I don't even know what I did. But I sure as heck am scrambling to figure out what I did so I can get back to that exalted status, because it feels so good to be in that exalted status.
Yeah, this goes really hand in hand with the previous technique. And if you don't believe us, just think about if you're an investigator into the church, or if you're a youth who's on track, how amazing you feel, how much social reinforcement is telling you you're awesome, telling you you're amazing, telling you you're chosen and a gift and a child of God. And just try diverging from the path, and you'll see how superficial all that love bombing, and I'm using that term very loosely here, but just see how superficial that community, that love, that praise is. Because as soon as you're saying, well, this is what works for me, even if it diverges from the group, you're shamed, you're cut off, you're kicked out, you're excommunicated. And that just shows you that it's really not about you. When you're praised individually within Mormonism, it's because you're emulating what the group wants you to be and do.
Right. Not for being yourself, not for your own creative,
insights.
interests. Yeah, it's because you're conforming. And I really wanted to use Saturday's Warriors lyrics in my book, but I couldn't. I had to, because they're copyrighted, and lyrics and copyright, there's no fair use at all. You're not allowed to fair use with lyrics. But who are these children coming down with glory trailing from their feet as they go? And that always just got me. I was a kid in the 80s, so that came out on VHS.
These are the warriors saved for Saturday. Together the last day of the world. These are they on Saturday, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was like the most, and I still, it gets me. I cry every time I watch that movie, even though I know it's full of crap.
These are the strong, the warriors rising in their might. Who is it? It's the elite, right?
Right, yeah. Exactly. And there's so many hymns too, same thing. So, and I think we get into, maybe we don't, in Us versus Them as well. So, So this is Janja Lalich from a Recovery from Cults, and she says she was in if I'm getting the right person right, she was in a political cult, the Democratic Workers Union or something like that in the 70s or 80s. And she said, at the same time I was being treated with a lot of favor, the words of praise overshadowed my inner doubts and fears. And then later in her story, she says, study group members had the sense that they were being observed, watched. Participation was encouraged, praised. All of this added to a growing sense of being special, of being part of an elite, of being chosen. And the thing is that's called spiritual surveillance. The feeling that she's reflecting there, the feeling that you are being watched. And I, to this day, I don't think every Mormon necessarily comes away with Mormonism with a feeling of being watched, but to this day, and it's not necessarily a creepy feeling. Sometimes it leads into the elitism, but there is this feeling, because I was told as a kid all the time that God is watching me and God is recording down, the angels are recording down my every action in the book of life. And to this day, that feeling of that I am being watched by someone is always there. So,
absolutely.
And elitism is how they get that, because you kind of feel special if you're not doing anything wrong. The idea someone's watching me, that can make you feel special.
Yeah. And by the way, dress code is a really important part of this elitism. You start feeling like, well, short hair on men is better. Long hair on women is better. The white shirt on men is better. Not showing your shoulders for women is better. And that's true about all the behavioral things. The cultural markers, not drinking alcohol makes you better. Not doing drugs makes you better. Not having premarital sex, not partnering with a partner and moving in and living with a boyfriend or girlfriend or a partner before marriage. All these things, all these behavioral, unique identifying markers in a high demand organization reinforce this sense of elitism.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It does. And that then becomes an incentive for doing those conforming behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely.
So within the church, how many conference talks start with flattery? I tend to notice that most of them tend to. And depending on the group that they're talking to, they're going to flatter the specific demographic that they're speaking to. So the women or the men or the youth or whatever. And the thing is, we're getting into not just like how Mormons feel elite compared to outsiders, but also how we're made to feel elite compared to other people within our group. Praise costs nothing. And it garners trust. When someone flatters you, there's a natural tendency to want to trust them because we want more of that. And like I said, men, women, and youth singled out separately for praise. So each person is put on a pedestal. And I wrote an essay for a feminist blog a few years back about how women are put on pedestals in these cultures because they can't see the chain around their feet. They're being praised all the time and told that they're free and told that they're appreciated and loved. Meanwhile, they don't actually have as much power as the men in the organization. And I think, just speaking more widely, every subdemographic within Mormonism is separately praised so that each one cannot see the chain around their feet. Supremacist thinking of one type leads to supremacist thinking in other types. So if we're the chosen of God, well, then maybe white people are the chosen of God. And if we're the chosen priesthood leaders, then maybe we're chosen because we don't think it consciously, but that's clearly because men are superior over women. And they literally are in that situation. They are being put in a position of active power over women. And so the scriptures make it clear what happens to groups of people who displease God, and it often has to do with skin color. So these sort of elitist hierarchical thinking leads to elitist hierarchical thinking in other ways that comes out in ways that aren't particularly religious. So the Mormon Church isn't getting up there, aside from the racist problematic things that they do say and that are in their scriptures, they're not actually standing up there saying the white race is the chosen race and we need to protect our heritage and our culture and we're going to do so at the expense of everyone else. They don't actually say that, but those are the conclusions that a lot of members are led to, especially when the whole Book of Mormon is based around people getting cursed based on the color of their skin, or cursed to have darker skin based on their righteousness.
Yeah.
So that's the danger.
Yeah. And this slide in particular, I almost gasped when I saw this image of a woman up on a pedestal with a ball and chain connected to her ankle. You can almost predict it. Anytime a patriarchy is complimenting someone very profusely, what they're really doing is sort of like lifting them up superficially so that they can continue to maintain unhealthy, unbalanced power over them. So whether it's the youth or women or minorities, you can just tell a patriarchy because of the extra showering praise is meant to say, we know we have so much power and influence over you, and it's pretty obvious. And so we're going to say, man, the men just wouldn't, the behind every good man is an even greater woman, or this church would fall apart without the women, or the youth are the most important thing. It's really just a masquerade for the patriarchy to stay in control, I think.
It is. And ultimately, we throw around the word power a lot. Ultimately, what does power mean? It means the ability to make decisions. And empowerment is the ability to make decisions for yourself. And power, raw power, is the ability to make decisions for other people. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to. In the church, men get to make decisions for everyone else. Like adult men get to make decisions for everyone else. And therefore, no matter what you say about everyone else, particularly adult white men, no matter what you say about everyone else, they still have the power to make decisions for everyone else. That's what it comes down to.
Absolutely. All right.
So we do
Here's
have
some examples. These are some great examples. Yeah.
Have some examples. So for women, David O. McKay, this is from the Teachings of Presidents of the Church. He said about women, the noblest calling in the world is motherhood. True motherhood is the most beautiful of all arts, the greatest of all professions. She who can paint a masterpiece or can write a book that will influence millions deserves the plaudits and admiration of mankind, deserves the highest honor that man can give, and the choicest blessings of God. So I think I left something out there, but basically they're saying, you can accomplish everything you want, but we're going to pat you on the head because you're being a mother instead of all that stuff. And personally, I think that those are all kind of equal. I think that raising children is certainly an honorable thing if that's what you choose and that's what sparks joy for you, and that is what leads to your self-actualization. For a lot of people that's true. A lot of men that's true of as well. And likewise for worldly accomplishments, also kudos to you. Kudos to anyone who follows their heart and expands their talents that they have, regardless of what they do.
Right.
So to the men, William R. Bradford in General Conference in 1979 said, "My dear brethren, this is a thrilling hour. At no time has there been a gathering such as this of the elect sons of God. Were it not for the power of the Spirit, I could not bear up the weight of this moment."
It's basically saying, we're all so amazing, men. Aren't we all so amazing? I can barely keep it together. We're so amazing.
We have the best mutual appreciation society. And then to the youth, 1974, and I picked some old quotes to show that this is nothing new. They've been saying the same thing this whole time. So 1974, as we look into their happy, clean, and appealing countenances and felt their enlightened presence, they radiated great moral strength and beauty. They reflected an inner light. These youth and young adults are part of an almost worldwide new aristocracy, as the elect of God who know that the source of all light is divine. And I thought that talk was interesting. I forget the name of the talk, but it's something like Toward a New Aristocracy or something like that. It's basically advocating for monarchy in modern times, religious monarchy, but it's still monarchy nonetheless. There's no even pretense to a democratic or egalitarian society here.
Yeah. And it's tough because, I have children and I have a spouse and I want to pay them compliments. I want to tell them I think they're amazing. When I see really cool things, I want to say, wow, I'm so impressed. So I guess what do we make of that?
Again, all of these things are fine on their own, and they're fine if they lead people to personal fulfillment and everyone's respecting their own boundaries and empowering themselves and others. Like, I want other people to have their own choices. If I ever get power, I don't want to use it. And I do have a little bit of power. I don't want to use it to dictate what I want for everyone else. what I want for everyone else is for them to dictate their own path. And so we can lift people up. We can praise people for their accomplishments or their inner strength or whatever we want. But what are we doing that for? Are we doing that so they feel better about themselves so they can make their own choices? Or are we doing that so we can exploit them? That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, just make sure you're not part of a unhealthy structure or system where those compliments are being used to coerce or manipulate or wield undue influence.
Right. Yeah. Are you using it to mask the fact that you are exploiting them, or are you using it to give them their own power? Yeah.
Yes, I love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So the thing about elitism is that certain individuals are deemed more elite. You can't have everybody be equally elite. It automatically leads towards people starting to compare each other to each other. The church is dependent upon a strict hierarchy with many at the top, many at the bottom, and very few at the top. That it just has to work that way. There are positions of status within the church. So even without the demographics, this is just callings. So you have auxiliary presidents, relief society president, quorum, elders quorum president, bishopric, stake presidency, and then you start moving up the chain, and now you have general authorities and the Q15, and it has to work that way. Egalitarian values aren't compatible with Mormonism. Mormonism would fall apart if everyone in the church had equal or similar, close to equal power. If we had the ability to bypass our bishop when we have a problem with the bishop and go up the chain and say, hey, this bishop's a problem, like he's a sexual abuser or he's an ecclesiastical abuser or a spiritual abuser and he's hurting people, there's no egalitarian mechanism there, and that serves the church's purpose. The church is more of a feudal monarchy than it is a democracy, but they have to pay lip service to society's values because otherwise people would go, and most people value equality, or they think they value equality. When they dig, again, values are what you act on. And so, but at the very least, we all think we value equality, whether we act on it or not. But the church has to pretend they value equality, but really they're instilling all of these, everyone has to be top tier, but not everyone can be top tier. Everyone wants to be top tier and they're promised to be top tier, but do the math.
And it reminds me of the Animal Farm quote, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. There also, I can see other risks to this. Well, first of all, Mormonism, anyone who's objective, even the most Orthodox Mormons I know will admit that sort of general authority worship is a real problem. Even the church now is having to backtrack on that because with the internet, it's just so easy to show, evil, awful, hateful, bigoted statements made by previous general authorities or statements that are contradictory between previous general authorities and current general authorities. And then there's just all when a general authority makes a mistake, the ripple effect is massive. And so for so many reasons, there are all the gaffes that are being made these days by Elder Bednar saying that, there are no gay people in the Mormon Church, and just all the different gaffes and problems that number one, elitism is rife in the church. We stand up. Elder Bednar gets mad when the members of the church don't stand up when an apostle enters the room. You go to general conference and everybody is drooling and fawning over the general authorities, and they even need and want that. You sing, you stand up and you sing, "We thank thee, O God, for a prophet," or "Hail to the prophet," the hymn about Joseph Smith. And we praise our prophets and leaders, and it's become a real problem in the church, but it's obvious. But there are so many problems with that, including the fact that if you believe all Mormons are awesome, well, what about those that are sexual abusers? You're maybe not on guard. If you believe all Mormon bishops are inspired and have the gift of discernment, what about those that are abusive or neglectful? You do business dealings with Mormons because they're most honest. What about the Mormons that cheat you and rip you off? Like, there's so many reasons why elitism is harmful to the membership and to the group, and yet it continues.
I worked for a company in Seattle that got bought by a Salt Lake City company that was run by clearly Mormons, and the worst company I have ever worked for, and absolutely dishonest, and fired everyone for no reason, and it was just. Yeah, but we trusted as a Mormon. I wasn't Mormon at the time in this particular instance, but as a Mormon, I did work for Mormons and I trusted them. And that, yeah, it just comes with it. Like, it's a system that is so interlocked and everything is connected to everything else. And it does suppress critical thinking. It suppresses the ability to say, that's mostly great, but here's the little problems that I have with it. And so then those little problems can grow and become bigger and bigger and bigger because there's no transparency on them. It reminds me of the scripture that says every sin will be shouted from the rooftops. And I think of social media when I see that, and I think of how social media is exposing not necessarily, the little guy for being gay. Oh no. But the big, powerful people for their corruption and the bad things that they're doing. So.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One more slide on this topic.
Next slide.
Just to drive home the point that specialness in such a system is conditioned upon perfect compliance. William R. Bradford from Conference in 2005 said, "Your status as the governing ones has been and remains conditional upon compliance with the terms set forth by the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, in our personal premortal life. Nothing about this is casual. It is serious business. It is so serious that God's affairs on earth and the salvation of all mankind rest upon it." And I have the mid 2000s internet meme that the cat serious business. And basically what it does is the need for perfect compliance gives them excuse to give everyone their promise of why not everyone gets their promised celestial cookie. So, we're going to promise salvation. We're going to promise all these great rewards, even happiness on earth and prosperity on earth. And not everybody is getting that. And so we're going to condition, it is so serious that God's affairs on earth and salvation of all mankind rest upon you special person right there. You got to act absolutely perfectly or else the whole thing crumbles and it'll be your fault.
And for me, one of the most dramatic examples of this are the missionaries that I've interviewed on Mormon Stories that were told that if you masturbate as a missionary, you won't have the Spirit, so you won't be able to convert. And thus, so many people won't get eternal salvation and will be effectively damned to Mormon hell for your wickedness of not being able to masturbate, which led at least one missionary to want to cut off his own genitals because he felt like his wickedness was keeping people out of heaven and keeping people from being saved. It's that elitism, that amplified language can really wreak havoc on participants' mental health.
It's a double-edged sword. Yeah.
All right. So that's elitism. So we're 2 down. That's good. We're making good progress.
What do you think the grade is on Mormonism?
Oh, Mormonism is dripping with elitism, pure blood, patriarchal blessings, chosen people, Gentile and chosen, God, Saturday's warrior. It's just all there. A+, unfortunately.
All right.
Yeah.
So that leads us right into us versus them thinking. So when you have elitism and black and white thinking and they get together and they have a baby, then that is us versus them thinking. So it basically us versus them thinking is black and white thinking that is applied to people, which makes it, if we're talking intellectually about black and white thinking, okay, that's some abstract intellectual thing, but this is about people and that totally changes, in my opinion, the morality of what they're doing. So what they do in any totalist group is they create an enemy or multiple enemies. Generally speaking, it is the people inside the group are the good guys and everybody else are the bad guys. But that is a flexible idea because sometimes you need people outside the group to be your allies. And so there's some doublespeak there and can kind of go back and forth depending on the needs of the moment. That allows the church to deflect blame, enforce elitism, enforce isolation, which is Malou control that we talked about, polarize people's thinking, halt careful consideration of outside ideas, increase trust for insiders, which you talked about, people wanting to use Mormon businesses because they trust them, while lowering trust in outsiders. There's a cost to that. And it establishes a persecution complex, which we'll talk about fairly extensively.
Yeah, and also it can be used as a proof that the church or the organization is true, because so geniusly as Joseph Smith baked into the Book of Mormon and to the Doctrine and Covenants that God's elite, God's chosen, will be persecuted. Then when the persecution happens, oh, well, it's just a fulfillment of prophecy. It really was a genius tenet to bake into the foundation of an organization, because then if you do awesome things, you're praised as an organization. And if there's any adversity, well, look at that. The Satan comes to get us, and Satan always persecutes the righteous, and this is a fulfillment of prophecy. It really is a win-win for the organization. And I just have to say, for me, and we'll talk about this, the biggest evidence of this in Mormonism was that you grow up with all the adversity. You're like, why did the Mormons go from New York to Kirtland to Missouri to Nauvoo to Salt Lake? And why was Joseph Smith getting tarred and feathered? And why was Joseph Smith being persecuted and thrown in jail? Well, it certainly could have been because Joseph was doing illegal things. It certainly could have been because he was violating the U.S. Constitution and the freedom of speech. It couldn't be because he was propositioning and sleeping with other men's wives. And it couldn't be because the church was super annoying to the people of Missouri or Illinois, or that they were threatening people's safety or disrupting the social and the political status of the people around them. It must have been that Satan was persecuting them. And it was just such a stark thing in my mind to realize that all the persecution of Joseph Smith and all the persecution of the early saints, if you read the history, was because of bad behavior. But as a Mormon, you can't ever believe that Mormons or Joseph Smith had bad behavior. And so it's all got to just flow to the bottom line of the church is true, and so we're going to get persecuted. And thus whitewash Mormon history. Yeah. Yeah.
And we'll talk a bit more about persecution coming up. I think the main thing there is that persecution can lead to cognitive dissonance. It's a form of social proof. It is a form of everyone saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And so the church has to have something that turns that you're wrong into you're actually right. And it is kind of brilliant. And that's why I do talk so much about cognitive dissonance, because I think all of these techniques can be explained in terms of how they are managing cognitive dissonance and consonance in favor of the group. And that's one such one.
Love it. So important.
So we have a couple quotes here from cult researchers. Michael Langoni, who is, I think he's still president of the International Cultic Studies Association, in Recovery from Cults, which he edited. He said, people outside the group are viewed as spiritually, psychologically, politically, or socially inferior, or as impediments to the members' development. Again, he's not talking about Mormonism here. So if you see any comparisons, that is a natural conclusion to come to. He wasn't persecuting Mormonism in particular at all. Margaret Thaler, singer from Cults in Our Midst, said, members internalize the group's value system and its sense of moral pretentiousness, intellectual superiority, and condescension toward the outside world. In the cult, members get points for showing moral disdain for non-members and for members who faltered or left the group.
And I'm reminded here of just every Mormon fast and testimony meeting I've ever attended where it's like, I just don't know how people outside the church can raise healthy kids, or I met someone whose loved one died and I felt so sad for them that they didn't have the gospel, because if only they had the gospel, then they would have blah, blah, blah. And even when it's not explicit, there's this condescending, like, too bad for all the other people in the world that don't have the amazing things that we have, and which actually ends up being counterproductive for the church because, as Mark Twain once said, travel is fatal to prejudice. Once you start going out in the world and seeing amazing Sikhs, amazing Muslims, amazing Jews, amazing Christians, amazing, atheists and agnostics, you're just like, wait a minute, I thought we had a monopoly on goodness and truth. And it turns out, why am I meeting all these people that are actually more Christian than me? Why do I know an atheist at work that's more kind than me? And it actually becomes a common crack in people's testimony once they actually get exposure to the real world.
It does. And social media has been big on that. And in fact, the next slide, I'm going to talk about dehumanization, which is how all of this comes together. And I'll add some stuff to this slide based on what you just said. So first of all, we tend to naturally have empathy for other beings, that particularly beings that we relate to in some way. So usually other human beings, but some people expand that out to all creatures. And it's a survival mechanism for us because, our ancient ancestors who were apes were facing the world, and there were all kinds of different survival mechanisms they could take on. They could be the strongest or the fastest. They have the biggest fangs or the most fur or the most camouflage. Those are all strategies that other species have used to survive. But the human species, the strategy was to empathize with people that you thought were in your tribe, within your close-knit group, within your family group, and your larger family group outside of that, your clan, and empathize with them and just do or die for them. And the individual losing their life in that situation, the individual that goes out and fights the tiger and loses but saves the rest of the team, that kept that trait continuing on. That's how evolution works. So the one person who sacrificed their lives to save the group, their genetic material being close knit to that group was also in the group. And so the rest of the group went on and survived. So we're naturally wired to empathize with other beings. But groups that want power or leaders who want power have to circumvent that. And you see this all throughout society, and it's called othering or dehumanizing. If you can make someone or a group of people seem like they are not human, objectification is another word. If you can objectify them and make them seem like they're not human, then that cuts off, it short circuits the empathy paths that we have for people. It just stops. And so they create an us versus them. And we see it along race lines, immigrants, if we can call them animals, criminals, beasts, diseased, we want to just get away from that. It makes us, like, as a survival technique, want to get away from that person or to hurt them, to end them so that they're no longer a threat to us. And so manipulators at all levels of society have gotten us all to fight amongst each other because you're not human, and oh, you're not human. No, you're not human. And we go back and forth. To get us to hurt each other. Now, you mentioned that when Mark Twain said the thing about travel, we have social media today, which is like the ability to travel. And it's amazing because while manipulators are using that to divide people, a lot of us like to connect to other people online, and we meet other people and we learn about their lives and we can feel towards them. So there was a study, I don't cite it here because I wasn't planning on talking about it. It might make us go a little longer. They did a study with narratives. So they found that people who are othered, that we don't know them very well, and manipulators have gotten us to dislike them or hate them. So often people from other cultures. They found that when you read a fictional narrative with a person from that background as the main character, that you empathize with them after reading the narrative the same way that you would empathize with them as if you were from their group. So, and this can be even with a broken foot, like I've never broken my foot. So I don't know what I have to do when I see someone who's broken their foot and I want to empathize with them. I have to use a different part of my brain. I have to use cognitive empathy. So I have to think about times I broke my finger. It must be kind of like that, only worse, but I'm not like actually feeling it. But you have affective empathy for things that you've actually been through. Well, they found that when you read a narrative about a person who'd been through that you actually gained affective empathy where you no longer had to imagine it. It was now as if you had experienced the thing yourself. And so this is why representation in media is so important, of having people on the screen who look different from us, because then we get that wiring to be able to empathize with them in their lives, even if it's fiction, whether it's fiction or not. It just has to be a narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, this is why it's so important that the churches use terms like apostate or infidel. It's why, what's that? Sinner.
Wicked.
Wicked. It's also why the church disfellowships and excommunicates people, because it's crucial to have a label. It's why they have member and non-member, right? Mm-hmm. It's a really essential way to basically say, to put someone in a bucket. You basically create this category or bucket that you can put people in. You can associate all sorts of negative labels with it. Weak, feeble, wanted to sin, never had a testimony to begin with,
Misled by
sinner,
Satan.
bad, dirty. What's that?
Misled by Satan.
Misled by Satan.
Mhm.
John Dehlin, whatever it is, you can associate all these negative labels or terms with a bucket. And then immediately when they go from being elite, beautiful, chosen, I'm so excited to be with you that I can't even contain myself. Oh, you stopped believing, you child of God? Let me throw you in this bucket, otherize you. You're no longer an individual. You're a nameless, faceless part of this group that we've already pre-demonized, and now you don't exist anymore. And one of the biggest testimonies of this is just try losing your faith. You could have been bishop or stake president in a ward forever. You could have served all these people, helped raise their kids, shared the best and the worst of their lives with them. Try leaving the church and staying in your ward. All of a sudden, crickets, nobody talks to you again. All those friendships dry up for the most part, and you realize it was all just very superficial. And that's because they've moved you from an individual who reinforced the collective needs of the organization into a category of the other where they have to just pretend you don't exist anymore. And the last thing they want to do is ask you, oh my gosh, why did you lose your faith? What happened? I trust you. I love you. I care about you. Let me learn all that I can about what's going on. And how can I serve you? Because you're still a child of God and I still want to be there for you. And now my Christian impulse is to go after the one and to care and serve you and need you. That's not what happens. Instead,
Right.
you're just bucketized, othered, you're forgotten, and you're marginalized. And that's
Because it would allow for empathy, because then you would hear that narrative that the studies show will give you empathy for someone who has gone through something that you haven't. You will then have empathy for the person who left the church. And then with that empathy, you'll be able to listen to them and hear them and care for them. And you just might be persuaded yourself out of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really quickly, Neil writes, it's really hard not to feel angry through this. And Neil, anger is actually a healthy emotion. So don't resist the anger, process it, lean into the anger, write about it, talk about it, get a therapist, get a coach, get a friend, process the anger and learn from what the anger is teaching you. And then channel it in healthy ways such that you never get fooled again, you never get abused again, and you can use whatever you've learned from this to pay it forward and help other people or to improve your life. There's a great episode on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast at mormonfaithcrisis.com about grieving and the importance of grief in a faith crisis and what we can learn from our emotions. I strongly recommend listeners check out that episode.
Yeah, and we were taught in Mormonism that anger is bad. And I think sometimes when we act on anger, it can be bad. If we're acting impulsively, we can hurt people unnecessarily with anger. But emotions, we talked about this in a previous part, emotions themselves are not moral. There's no moral good or bad about an emotion. Emotion can be uncomfortable and it can be driving you to do something that you might regret later. But when you have self-awareness and you're not just suppressing that feeling, when you can allow yourself to let that, it's uncomfortable, but there's meditation techniques where you let that feeling course through you and you sit with it and you blank out your mind and you just let whatever's going to come up, just let it. Don't punch anybody, don't hurt anybody, don't kick the cat or anything, but just like sit with it and breathe and let yourself feel it and observe where it's going through your body, and then observe what ideas might be coming up of what you might be able to do about that feeling that is healthy and constructive. So
yeah, that's a way healthier approach.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So we have a quote from Philip Zimbardo and Susan Anderson. I have a hard time including Zimbardo in anything anymore because he got caught out faking parts of the Stanford prison experiment, but it's a good quote, and I don't want Susan Anderson to suffer for Philip Zimbardo's misdiscretions or whatever. So
let's not fall privy to purity culture, right?
Right?
You can do some good things and still do some other bad things and still have done good things, right? How's that?
Exactly. So that's how I resolve it. So he says, says, while we-they dichotomies cut us off from others and suggest we think of them in terms of dehumanizing labels, such as animals, sinners, queers, rednecks, women's libbers, the teeming masses, and so forth.
Apostates, right?
Yep, exactly. Nothing is so simple as the labels good and evil suggest. They foster utter vulnerability to whatever system is the good one, naturally the one that wants our support. So, yeah, and I try to avoid those labels. If the label is accurate and descriptive, then I'll use the label, and if I'll use the label. But if the label is purely a slur and has no, it is just there to make the person look bad, it's not descriptive of them. If it's descriptive and it makes them look bad, like racist, because like the thing that they're doing is actually racist, then that's like a different thing. But when we thoughtlessly throw around, and I love that he uses a mix of ones, he uses rednecks in there. Like, I generally avoid the term redneck. It's not constructive. It's not helpful to anyone. So.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about this probably a little bit later too. If you think about, totalitarian or fascist organizations, they always need an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Because having an enemy gives you something to fight against and be strong against. So for Hitler, it was the Jews, and for the Mormons, it's apostates or non-members, like or the LGBT people or whatever it is. You always have to have an enemy, because that gives an organization something to fight against, something to strive for. It's a very powerful reinforcing mechanism in an organization, unfortunately.
It is. Yep.
Yeah.
So the next slide, we have a quote from Stephen Hassan from Releasing the Bonds about how us versus them can create phobias about leaving the organization. And so it says, from the point of view of a mind control cult, there is never a legitimate reason to leave. The only people who leave are weak, selfish, or cannot control their need for sex, drugs, or other addictive substances. In the mindset of the group, people who leave are incapable of sacrificing or transcending spiritually. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was terrified. I was terrified that if I made the wrong decisions, when I was considering divorcing my husband, I was 19 years old and I was considering divorcing. He was a convert. I converted him and we got married outside the temple. And then I was pregnant and I had a baby. And then he turned out to be an abusive asshole, not the same abusive asshole as the other, not as much abusive as my other one. And I was like, man, but if I divorce him, then I'm probably going to leave the church, and then I'm probably going to shack up with some guy and become promiscuous and just go around and then I'm going to get hooked on drugs. And then I'm going to be in an alley somewhere with a heroin needle sticking out of my mind. That's the cascading thing. And that's where us versus them played its role in there, is because I'd had this picture painted of the wicked world out there. And there's no other reason for them to make any choice in their lives other than that they're following Satan and trying to do evil. And that's where I went, was that's what's going to happen to me. I ended up divorcing him, and some of those things came true, but not necessarily in that context. And I certainly never ended up in an alley with a heroin needle sticking out of my arm, because that's just not how the world usually works. So,
yeah. And I'm always reminded of the quote that I first heard from Thomas McConkie: "A cult is any organization that won't let you leave with your dignity intact." Mm-hmm. And it's an unhealthy organization if they're like, you can't go, horrible things will happen, versus a healthy organization would say, hey, I'm glad we were able to help you for a while. Oh, you're taking off to go learn something else? Godspeed, good luck. And we'll, if we can help you in any way, let us know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a quote from Steve Sanchez, who wrote a memoir about his time in a combination New Age Christian cult called the SLF. I think it stands for Spiritual Light Foundation in California. And he said, Reverend Will painted all those who had left SLF as having fallen into karmic ruin. When we heard this, part of us was vengefully delighted that we were doing so much better than those who had left. And the other part of us was full of dread and determined to never suffer such an unthinkable fate. So that sounds familiar to me too. I related to his memoir quite a bit. and some quotes from the church itself to see if the church really promotes this or if this is just some little cultural thing that the members have imagined up all on their own. James J. Humula from conference in 2008, in a conference talk entitled Winning the War Against Evil, he says, "We are entering the final stages of a great war. This war commenced from before the foundations of the world and has been pursued with awful consequence throughout the world's history. I speak of the war between the followers of Christ and all those who deny him as their God." So that seems pretty incontrovertible that the church is stirring this stuff up. This is one example of many. And then Delbert L. Stapley, from the Ensign in 1975, so they've been doing this for a while, said, "All good things come from God, all evil comes from Satan." And yeah, when I went looking for these quotes when I was writing my book, and so I read the stuff from the literature, the cult research literature, and then I was like, well, I know Mormonism does this stuff, so I'm going to go onto the website, lds.org, and I'm going to search these conference talks. I had to throw a dart and I would get the examples that I needed. Like, I'm not a good dart player either. It just, I was the first result, the second result, the fifth, the 10th result. They were all absolute perfect quotes to display, to demonstrate these techniques. So.
Yeah. And I also just want to say we should all be hesitant whenever war rhetoric is being used in any circumstance. I've been listening to Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, and there's this idea that whatever you fight, you strengthen. And if you just want to look at it, the war on drugs, how successful has it been? Have we stamped out marijuana and cocaine and meth and heroin? Or is it, or did we only just increase and strengthen methods of producing illegal drugs? The war on crime, have we eradicated crime from our society, or are our prisons do we have more prisons and are they more populated than ever? But just in and of itself, war is evil. War is literally, I think, the worst thing on the planet. I can't think of anything worse than war. Men, women, children tortured, killed, mass amounts of people poisoned and killed, dismembered, disfigured. Why would we ever want to invoke war metaphors ever? And Here we have Jesus, the Prince of Peace, being used as like the chief warrior. And the Book of Mormon is just rife with war metaphors and war examples. And I just think we all need to be really, really have second thoughts or have suspicious dispositions when war rhetoric is being used.
Definitely. And I have a whole, I think about half of the Us versus Them chapter, I think it's the Us versus Them chapter in my book, is actually citing all the war reference and talking about war references. And I mean, just the hymns alone. And I did find a number of hymns that were out of copyright, so I was able to quote them. Yeah. We are all enlisted till the conflict is o'er.
We are all enlisted till the conflict is o'er. Soldiers in the army, there's a bright crown in store, right?
Yeah. And what do soldiers do? They follow orders without flinching. That's what they do. And that's what we're supposed to be as good Mormons.
Yeah. And then that's all wrapped in the us versus them kind of rhetoric.
Exactly.
It comes hand in hand, right, with the us versus them rhetoric.
Yeah, and we're fighting other human beings who have a right to be who they are. I mean, I believe in fighting actual evil. I believe in fighting those who want to take power to make decisions on behalf of other people. I believe in fighting people who oppress and hurt and cause harm and all of that. I believe in fighting them, but that's different than just us in our group versus absolutely everybody else. Everyone else is evil without even listening to them or hearing them out or seeing what they're all about. You just hate them automatically. That's what this is about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing is the greatest threat to a totalist group is its former members, because former members were trusted at one point. They have insider knowledge. They speak the language. They know the doctrines inside and out. They know when the group is contradicting their doctrines through their actions. And so they are the best ones to point to the problems within the group. Now, a healthy group would take that advice and take that input, and they would work on those problems and try to solve them. But we're not talking about healthy groups here. We're talking about totalist groups. And so these people who are former members who would otherwise be trusted because of their connections and their expertise, the way you'd trust a Ford owner who, if you're looking to buy a car and you want to know how good a Ford was, you might go talk to someone who owns a Ford and talk to them about their experience with the car. Well, they want to stop that. They want to put a stop to any of that. So, and also it creates the question, if the group is so great, why would anyone leave? It contradicts the social proof of the group. And so that any totalist group has to make former members the worst enemy of them all.
Yeah.
So,
And if you, and I actually did a TikTok about this because somebody's like, well, don't listen to John Dehlin on TikTok because he's a bitter, angry ex-Mormon. And I'm like, I just have to say that I think ex-members of a religion are on average way better sources to consult than members of a high demand religion. And if, if you're Mormon, which would you rather trust about Scientology, a Scientologist or an ex-Scientologist? If you're a Mormon, who would you rather trust about Jehovah's Witnesses, a current Jehovah's Witness or an ex-Jehovah's Witness? Obviously, but if you just go to like consumer ideas, if somebody's trying to sell you their used car, would you trust them more, or would you trust, let's just say, the mechanics who have worked on that car who don't have a vested interest in selling you the car? Objective third parties, people who are willing to be critical and positive and who don't have a vested self-interest in your conclusion are almost always, how about the producer of a product? Would you rather trust their reviews on Amazon or 1,000 people that have actually used the product and are giving you their realistic experience with the product? It's always going to be that. And I think this is obvious to everyone except people who aren't open-minded, really.
Right. Unless you have something to hide, and then the manipulator is incentivized to muddy the waters and get you to only listen to them.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So stay away from former members. And that's why, again, the church excommunicates apostates, labels them. It's as a way to tag them as dangerous, tag them as unsafe, so that members won't ever listen to them or they won't have any influence on them.
Yeah. Yeah. And this next slide talks about that. And it's in the word excommunication. Don't listen. Stop communicating. And Mormonism isn't the only high demand group that uses the terms disfellowshipping, excommunication, and similar type language. And the point of that is to other the person. I was trying to remember if I could read the little, because there's a picture of all of these weird looking birds. Yeah. And they're picking on all the weird looking birds are picking on another weird looking bird. And it says
othering, noun. The perception or representation of a person or group of people as fundamentally alien from another, frequently more powerful group.
Yep.
Yeah. And othering through disfellowshipment or excommunication is important. And this can be political. This doesn't have to be religious. We do this politically. If someone doesn't agree with us politically, sometimes we disfellowship or excommunicate them. Mm-hmm. Corporations can do this. These are all things that unhealthy organizations can do.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so now we get to persecution, which we were talking about at the beginning. As we discussed, persecution can be a source of cognitive dissonance via social proof. And criticism is worse because there's all these people who have experience with the organization or are objective third parties who don't have a stake in the game. And they're saying we're wrong and they're being civil about it. That's going to be a threat to our beliefs. So what happens is the Totalist organization reforms these into a consonance causing cognition. So they can turn it around. They are against us because we're right. If they weren't against us, then maybe we'd be wrong, but they're against us. And so we're right. And if no one is against us, so let's say the Joseph Smith times are over and Mormons are living in relative peace with relative lack of persecution, and no one is against us, so then we have to imagine that everyone's against us even when they aren't. And that's where you get a persecution complex, the idea of being persecuted when you're not actually being persecuted. In the next slide, I have definitions of some of these terms. So the Oxford Dictionary defines a persecution complex as an irrational and obsessive feeling or fear that one is the object of collective hostility or ill treatment on the part of others. But it defines persecution itself as hostility and ill treatment, especially because of race or political or religious beliefs. And it defines criticism as the expression of disapproval of someone or something based on perceived faults or mistakes. And in Mormonism or any other high demand group, all of these concepts get conflated together, and it's to stop critical thinking. It's so that you cannot tell the difference between a well-reasoned, compassionately delivered expression of criticism versus hostility and ill treatment, especially because of religious beliefs. If you can't separate those things in your mind, then you won't be able to listen to rational critical thought. And there's a quote.
And it's really unfortunate for an organization, because if an organization is open to criticism, to thoughtful criticism, it can improve. Mm-hmm. And if a church or organization is open to science, for example, they can learn, oh my gosh, we had it wrong about same-sex attraction or LGBT people. We had it wrong about race. We had it wrong about women or whatever it is. You can learn and improve and hurt less people. Mm-hmm. But if you're defensive, if you've got to carry this mantle of being perfect and persecuted all the time, and that any criticism means that you're under attack and being assaulted, you can't engage in the self-correction that would improve your organization and or improve the health and the well-being of many of the marginalized within your organization.
And it transforms into abuse at that point. That's when it becomes abuse. So Steve Sanchez from the memoir Spiritual Perversion said, to all of us SLF members, being persecuted by the outside galvanized the feelings of being elite and righteous in all our endeavors. Again, SLF is or was a high demand group in California called the Spiritual Light Foundation, kind of a combination Christian New Age group. So if he said that, maybe it can apply to us. So does the church have a persecution complex?
The Mormon Church, right?
The Mormon Church, yes.
Yeah.
The church with a capital C. So Russell M. Nelson posted to Facebook in 2019, the church, when restored in its fullness, will prepare the world for the coming of the Lord, but as members, we will be persecuted for our beliefs. We must fortify ourselves against the attacks of the adversary. And Stephen E. Snow in the New Era in 2013 said the church has always been a minority, and it seems like we've always had a target on our back. We will always face adversity, and we might as well get used to that. And the next slide, I have my answer to that. Now, I don't like minimizing.
Saying, "Oh, really?"
Oh, really? Yes, it's the meme. It's the "oh, really" meme, and I don't like minimizing anybody's pain, and so it's a difficult subject for me to talk about, because there are experiences that all Mormons have had where people slightly looked down on us. We were a little bit marginalized and a little bit on the fringes. But as I'll get into, if we're going to judge the truthfulness of an organization based on the level of persecution they're receiving, Mormons in modern day have it pretty easy. So we'll get to that. But next, I want to see like an example of kind of how Mormons are seen by the world. So this is from the Mormon Moment article, the famous Newsweek article in 2011. And they said, the result is an organization that resembles a sanctified multinational corporation, the General Electric of American religion, with global ambitions and an estimated net worth of $30 billion. Now, I'm going to asterisk on that because we now know it's a little more.
Hundreds of billions. It is now hundreds of billions.
At least 130 that we know of.
No. It's certainly 200 billion, because that's just the investment arm. So it's 130 plus the revenue. Core assets of the church. It's got to be 200 billion or more. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So the article continues, the church runs and finances one of the largest private universities in the country, Brigham Young University. More than many other faiths, the Mormon Church prepares its members to engage intelligently with the broader culture and with the wider world. And the next slide, I have some actual persecution. again, I feel weird saying that because I don't want to do oppression Olympics, but I do want to put into perspective what actual persecution is like in the modern times. So if persecution made a religion true, then the Branch Davidians have more access to God in 1993 than Mormons did, and Black trans lesbians are God's favorite prophets. So I have a picture of the fire burning at the Branch Davidian compound where a whole bunch of people died. I'm still not sure if they know exactly who exactly started the fire, but we know that if the feds had not been there bearing down and making all sorts of incompetent decisions, that fire would have never have happened. It was just a mess. I don't take sides in that one, but it was a mess. And surely they are definitely far more persecuted in the modern times than Mormons are. And another picture is from a vigil for a Black trans man, Tony McDade, murdered in Tennessee on May 27th, 2020, one of the many Black trans people whose lives have been stolen every year. So I just want to point out that, yeah, there's persecution involves people actually being murdered for who they are, and called names on a regular basis and rejected from their families and kicked and fired from jobs and kicked out of their apartments. And that is what LGBT people go through. That is what a lot of people of color go through. That is what a lot of immigrants go through. I mean, we're talking about not even letting immigrants in our country. We're rounding them up and putting them into cages. And Mormons want to cry. I feel so conflicted about this because they don't want. But yeah, Mormons want to cry. Oh no, we're so persecuted in 2020. And I'm sorry, but getting asked about your magic underwear isn't. And I think there are definitely some Mormons who fall into categories where they do face like stronger persecution. They may face job discrimination or other things. So there are definitely Mormons who are exceptions to this, but for the most part, Mormonism is generally seen as a relatively good thing in our world, and Mormons have a lot of power. They tend to get jobs. Yeah.
I mean, I think you can use the ultimate litmus test in the United States of your social status is, do you have U.S. senators or presidential candidates and or major candidates for president that represent your group. And so, for example, Protestant white men, probably not marginalized groups in the United States. Even Catholic white men, once John F. Kennedy and Joseph Biden have been elected, Catholic white men have arrived. Women, not so much. Gay and lesbian trans people, not so much. And again, to take the position that Mormons are persecuted as a foundation, we've got U.S. senators, we've got tons of members of the House of Representatives, and then recently he didn't win, but Mitt Romney was chosen as the primary candidate for president of the United States. Once you reach just now a person of color, Barack Obama finally gets elected as president, but then if you count up all the presidents historically, just one person of color, that's the real sign. Mormons have so much power. And then I just also want to highlight the fact that nowadays, whenever the Mormon Church cries persecution, it's usually because they want to continue discriminating against a minority group like women, like trans people, like gay and lesbian people. And they'll say, oh, don't tell us at BYU we have to allow gay and lesbian students to be students and to live fulfilling, healthy, meaningful lifestyles. And then they hide behind the shroud or the shield of discrimination. Oh, you're trying to violate our religious rights. You're trying to violate our freedom of religion and religious beliefs. By forcing us to treat LGBTQ people humanely or women humanely or people of color humanely. And it's a really unfortunate tactic.
Yeah. There's also a lot of Fortune 500 executive representation. Mormons are in a lot of those as well, which is also very powerful positions.
Yeah.
White Mormon men particularly.
Yeah.
So Mormonism isn't the only high demand group to play the persecution card. During the Jonestown massacre in Guyana in 1978, he used actually the persecution card to convince those 900 people to drink the cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, Flavor Aid, and their children. He said, and I've listened to these tapes and they're harrowing. You can find them online. He said in those moments before the massacre, he said, "Don't be afraid to die. You'll see. They'll torture some of our children here. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this." And that's from FBI tape number Q042, and it's available for listening at archive.org, and massive trigger warning on that. And he has this general authority kind of voice that he speaks with, kind of a little bit of a drawl, and he's got an elderly, kind sounding voice, and he delivers this message with that voice.
Yeah, and I also just think the stakes are really high, because when you combine a millennialistic organization that believes the end of times are near, believes that Jesus is going to come anytime, and then you add this us-them persecution complex, you get what happened in the FLDS compounds, you get what happened with the Branch Davidians, you get what happened in Guyana and Jonestown. And honestly, Mormonism could have just as easily burnt up and imploded and exploded with Joseph Smith's behavior in its final years. And if Joseph hadn't been killed, and if Brigham Young hadn't have taken over and moved everybody far, far away, you could have had a war and or mass deaths. And you even look at Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow and a lot of these Mormon preppers. It is super dangerous to have the spiritualistic kind of worldview combined with an end of times theology, combined with us-them thinking. It's just a matchbox for carnage.
Yeah. And this is how they convince terrorists to fly planes into buildings and to blow themselves up. These are the exact same techniques that are used. Doctrine over self, which promotes the purposes of the group over your own individual safety. And they're very, very powerful mechanisms that can get people to do that.
Yeah. The whole teaching of infidels, right?
Yeah.
All right. So to conclude with us-them.
Yeah, so let's just keep in mind that we don't suddenly become evil or justified just because of the groups we join. We're all the same, and we can increase our ability to empathize and treat our fellow travelers with charity and kindness when we remember that. So that's my goal, is to pursue learning empathy for other people and base my decisions on rationality and people's actual proven behavior rather than just what group they're in.
Yeah, and I think humility is just a really important virtue, and I hope as progressive and post-Mormons we can have humility. We're not better than anyone because we're ex-Mormons or progressive Mormons or liberal Mormons or post-Mormons. All believers aren't all dumb. They're not all stupid. They're not all inferior, weak. They're brilliant and they're good. And there's good things about being in the church. There's good things about leaving the church. We're not better than anybody, and we have to continually guard against these things, because lest we as progressive or post-Mormons become the monster we were running from.
Exactly. And there'll be a time when you're first leaving the church, when you're still reacting off those same levers that have been installed in you. You might be acting the opposite way. You might be just completely rejecting it and going the complete, but that's still a reaction to the lever. You're still under their control when you're doing that. And so you will often fall into those same patterns of thought. And that's normal. It's to be expected. You are who you are, and you are acting like you're acting in the world. And so just go easy on yourself, and learn this stuff. And there's so many resources available to help you learn how to become a better person and how to be more of a free thinker and self-actualize and help yourself and the people that are closest to you.
Yeah, we have a great comment from a listener. Claudia writes, I listened to Luna's book. I would now like to buy a hard copy because so much of it is in lists, and lists don't always translate well orally, and that's true. And then Claudia writes, as the reader read quotes from general authorities, I found my anxiety rising and realized that just hearing that information was triggering the desired response. This is a brilliant work of synthesis. And that's right, Claudia. Please go buy this book in any or all of its forms, Recovering Agency by Luna Lindsey Corbden. Thank you, Claudia, for that.
I'm glad that's helpful, Claudia. Yeah.
All right. So we're on to the next point. Oh, by the way, us, them, what grade does the Mormon Church get? This isn't me being super biased, trying to paint the church in negative ways. I really am trying to look objectively here. But how can anybody claim that the Mormon Church doesn't get an A+ in us them mentality? We win the, along with many other high demand religions, we stand toe to toe with them in terms of us them. We just do.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So the next one is dispensing of existence. What is that, Luna Lindsey Corbden?
That is a really complicated way to say death threat. That is the scientists that came before me, not me, came up with that term. And it can be an eternal death threat. In religious groups, it tends to be an eternal death threat. You will die if you don't do as I say. Now, death can be literal, which it sometimes is, or it can be figurative, which our brains will register similarly as it does to a physical death. Death of self is basically our brain can't distinguish between physical death and the death of the self or the identity. And so we fear them both equally. So it can include spiritual death or infinite punishment. It can include loss of identity or the self. It can include loss of purpose or core moral center or loss of community. And it serves to induce phobias, which is another technique, another mind control technique. It can suppress doubts and the self, and it can instill demand for purity as it threatens a dire consequence for failure to match up with the expectations of the group.
And obviously for me, the first thing that comes to mind is the Christian teaching of hell, that if you don't do what Jesus says or do what the church says, you're going to burn in hell forever. Of course, Mormonism has its own version of that, which is the multiple levels of heaven. I'm sure you're going to talk about all this in a second. And then there's just this idea of spiritually sick or spiritually dead. Oh, your countenance is darkened. There's just all this fear-based language. And of course, the doctrine of eternal families, which Mormonism tries to sell as, oh, how beautiful, you get to be with your family forever. But what that does is it creates the scarcity such that you've got this constant fear that you won't be with your spouse or your children or your loved ones in the hereafter. Mm-hmm. It's all different versions of this idea of dispensing of existence.
Exactly.
Even outer darkness, Even outer darkness. Yep.
Yeah. And what is outer darkness? But you're existing and nothing is happening forever and ever and ever and ever. That's different than the atheist idea of you just go to sleep and never wake up. There's no awareness there to experience anything. That's different than being aware and awake through nothing.
Eternal torment, eternal punishment.
Yeah. Yes. And what kind of a God does that anyway? Anyway, that's a whole other. So here's some quotes from the literature. Stephen Hassan from Releasing the Bonds said, "Dispensing of existence is the belief that people in the group have the right to exist, and all ex-members and critics or dissonants do not." And Robert J. Lifton from Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism said, "The totalist environment draws a sharp line between those whose right to existence can be recognized and those who possess no such right. One underlying assumption makes this arrogance mandatory, the conviction that there is just one path to true existence, just one valid mode of being, and that all others are perforce invalid and false." So it's really about who has the right to exist, and the organization is saying we're the ones that get to decide or dictate who is going to exist and who isn't.
And it's just so obvious that this exists, not just in Mormonism, but in Christianity more broadly and probably other faith traditions. Actually, not as much in other faith traditions, but how many people don't leave the church because it's like, well, what happens when I die? I want to be with my loved ones in the hereafter. I don't want to go to hell. I don't, and that fear is a very important, powerful binding force to people's continued observance of a faith tradition.
Yeah. And other religions that are not Christian based without the patriarchal authoritarian sort of chain have found ways within their own cultural, theology to have their own version of dispensing of existence. And again, for totalist groups, that's what they can do. So they can come up. Buddhism's, from my study of it, kind of resists this. just because of the core theologies of the main core of Buddhism. However, there are Buddhist high demand groups who have found a way to create a form of dispensing of existence, even within the more free, in my opinion, more free flowing and self actualization type of beliefs of Buddhism. That can still be turned around.
Yeah, and Islam definitely has, a torture, punishment in the afterlife.
Right.
Sure.
And it's a patriarchal authoritarian. There are some groups of Islam that aren't, but the ones we generally think of are patriarchal and
Orthodox Islam.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So dispensing of existence. So due to the nature of the cult pseudo personality, which we've talked about again, where they promote the doctrine over the self and use social pressure and other cues to encourage us to sort of create a persona that is different than we would if we were following our hearts. So that is what I mean by cult pseudo personality. Because that pseudo personality is so based on good favor within the group. If you leave the group, that is a death of your identity. Your identity is going to die. When we left Mormonism, a vast portion of our identity had to die. We had to go through that experience. So, and then once you're shunned from a totalist group, some will wonder if life is even worth continuing. And that is a really rickety time when you're going through a faith crisis, where that yourself is threatened and your connection to physical life, your psychological connection to that starts to get really wobbly, and it's a kind of a dangerous time.
Absolutely.
So, mm-hmm.
Yep.
So let's look at
this is a really cool list of kind of concepts that a church teaches you to instill fear. This is a great list for those who can't see it. Yeah.
So it's a chart, and I have two columns. The first column is with the church I am, and the second column is without the church I am. So with the church I am good and worthy, spiritual and righteous, honest and upright, kind and generous, a follower of God, destined for eternal life, and I have a feeling of peace. Without the church I am unworthy, wicked, and evil, a sinner and lost, a liar and a backbiter, angry and hateful, a follower of the most evil being ever, Satan, destined for separation from God, even outer darkness, and it creates a panic.
Yeah. So it's just this, it's kind of binary thinking. Nobody's any of these things. Nobody's purely good or purely bad, purely worthy, purely not. It's this idea of, instead of just like learning, it's kind of this growth mentality of like, hey, I'm learning every day. You're either righteous or a sinner. You're either an honest person or a liar. There's no middle ground. It's just creating these binaries where you either have to feel like you're totally in or you're totally out, and totally in is the best ever, and totally out is the most evil, wicked ever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's threatening that your core ideals and your sense of identity and your sense of purpose and those things that make you, and the death of that personality is similar to feeling like you're actually dying. Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely. And it's this, it's reinforced with this idea that, oh, you've left the church, there's darkness in your countenance, you've lost your light. That's all part of this reinforcing mechanism.
Mm-hmm. That's sort of the social proof side of it. Yeah. So I have a quote in the next slide by Janja Lalich from Recovery from Cults. Again, she was in a political cult. She says, once in this world, as awful as it was, being thrown to the outside became an unthinkable alternative. It meant failure to meet the test. Even worse, it meant failing the working class, betraying the ideals that first attracted us to the party's pitch. It also meant acknowledging that we had bought into a horrible lie, and in so doing had hurt our comrades as they had hurt us. Once caught in such a trap, decent human beings, which we were, don't easily say, sorry, friends, I'm getting out of here. Rather, they look for ways to rationalize their subservience and exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And this is from, again, the memoir by Stephen Sanchez. He's quoting Reverend Will, who ran his high demand group, SLF. Reverend Will says, I guarantee you this. If you people leave, you will do just like them. First, you'll stop reading. Then you'll stop running your energy. Then you'll stop grounding. With each step, your information is lost. It's erased. You gradually go back to sleep. And I'm telling you, you are 100 times worse off than if you had never started this. When you go to sleep, it's spiritual death. It's exactly like a heroin addict who cuts his wrist because he can't get another fix. When you give in to the spirit of the world, you feel euphoria. It's got you. The dark angels come and take you up, take you down, just like those shadows took the evil guides down in the movie Ghost. So I saw some familiar words in there. He's using some loaded language from his particular group. We can see that there. And we can also see that he's using some words that Mormonism uses, particularly spiritual death jumped out at me, and talking about addictions and how if you leave, you'll fall into addiction. And also demon.
What I'm reminded of is the Mormon temple ceremony when Satan goes on his little monologue in the movie and says, if you do not live up to every commandment, every covenant made in the Lord's house this day, you will be in my power. You know, that whole monologue, fear, be very, very afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I have a chart in the next one. So if you're listening to this, you might want to take a screenshot, or I do have a copy of this chart in my book. So this is again about how we can create an illusion of choice. Sorry, my window's open. You can create an illusion of choice, and where people think they're getting a choice, but really they don't actually have a lot of options. So in the pre-existence, our choices were, we could follow all of God's rules on the threat of being cast out of heaven, or we could follow unrighteous dominion, where we would follow all of Satan's rules, or else, with an implied or else. I don't know what Satan's threatening to do to us if we don't follow his rules. They don't really specify that. So on earth, we have two choices presented to us by the church, and we have a third choice that the church hides from us. So our choices the church presents are, we can follow the choice of agency, where we follow all of God's rules on the threat of spiritual death. Great choice. Or we have the worst choice, which is we can be evil. We can be tempted by Satan into not following God's rules, at which time God will cast you out. What we're not told is that true freedom is found in your own authenticity.
Yeah, and what we're also not told is what every other and this is where there's a difference between high demand religions and other mainstream non-cults or non-high demand religions. There is this option of like, hey, be a buffet cafeteria participant. Believe the things you want to believe. Don't believe the things you don't want to believe. Obey the things you want to believe, or just choose, not even obey, choose to follow or practice the things that work for you. Don't choose the things you don't. Attend when you want. Don't attend when you don't want. Pay whatever you want. Don't pay whatever you don't want. And just, have the religion fit what works for you in your life versus fitting your life to the specifications of the religion. High demand religions don't do that. You're either all in or you're all out. You're either a card carrying, temple recommend holding, devout, Orthodox, true blue Mormon, or you're a problem.
Mm-hmm. And it does kind of come down to the choice of your existence versus the organization's existence. If they let us, speak freely, like in a Sunday school meeting, I would love to just say, what if the Book of Mormon is just a work of fiction like Shakespeare? It doesn't mean that there's no truth to be found within the works of Shakespeare, because there are plenty of great, brilliant insights into the human condition. And there's a few moments like that in the Book of Mormon. Let's talk about that. If I was allowed to say that, now the church's existence is threatened, because then other people can say their wild ideas about the Bible and the Book of Mormon and the words of the prophets. And now we're all talking about different ideas, and we're exploring different ideas. And now the pressure, the cultural pressures to conform at all costs gets to lift up. And now people are saying, well, maybe I don't want to pay my tithing. Maybe I only want to pay on my net instead of my gross, or, and now the church doesn't have bazillions of dollars coming in. And now the church starts to worry, well, we're going to lose members over this. So it kind of comes down to a choice between, does the church want to keep existing, or do you want to keep existing? And maybe and I don't necessarily think that dichotomy is literally true, but I think that the leaders of an organization, and someone like Joseph Smith, who started this thing, probably felt like it was a choice between the existence of the church or the existence of the individuals.
Yeah. And also leaders don't want you thinking that sometimes they make mistakes, and sometimes they actually really get it wrong. And so you should use your own choice to decide if you should follow or believe what a leader says or not. And ironically, just to mention Joseph Smith, a lot of Mormon theology grows out of Joseph's brother Alvin dying, and Joseph Smith's concern about his own parents because he had a mixed faith family. Who goes to heaven, who doesn't? Some were Presbyterians or Methodists, others weren't. Some were Universalists. And so there's an early Universalist Unitarian impulse within Mormonism. But then as the theology around multiple levels of heaven and all these sacred secret rites, ordinances that have to be done in a Mormon context with Mormon authority, Mormon priesthood, it starts out very open and universalistic and Unitarian, and then it starts clamping down again using the priesthood authority and exclusive truth claims and exclusive ordinances, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. And literal death threats. I mean, the history of the church is full of people like Brigham Young, the Blood Atonement, and the Danites running around. And yeah, there were actually people in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Yeah, people actually did die for their choices within or adjacent to Mormonism during that time.
Yeah,
and people still do. I mean, you brought up the point about LGBTQIA suicides, and other people who don't fit into the church very well are at higher risk of suicide. So
absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, let's see. Does the church teach this? Well, let's see. 2 Nephi 2:27 says, "Wherefore men are free according to the flesh, and all things are given them which are expedient unto man, and they are free to choose liberty and eternal life through the great mediator of all men." That sounds pretty good. Or, what's my second choice? I'm so excited. Or to choose captivity and death according to the captivity and power of the devil, for he seeketh that all men might be miserable like unto himself. So that's it. You're free, I have it in quotes, to choose, and I have that one in quotes.
Yeah, not much of a choice. And again, you make the point, it's a false choice. It's extreme. It's either free, liberty, eternal, with God, happy, or death, devil, miserable. And those are your only two choices. Yep. And we can't even see other possibilities. And that's right in the Book of Mormon, right?
Right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Mosiah, also in the Book of Mormon, he had to say, "But this much I can tell you, that if you do not watch yourselves and your thoughts and your words and your deeds," and I put in parentheses, "if you don't mind control yourself," because that's what he's describing, "and observe the commandments of God and continue in the faith that ye have heard concerning the coming of our Lord, even unto the end of your lives, ye must perish. And now, O man, remember and perish not." I have a picture. It reminded me of Beavis and Butthead, where Beavis pulls his shirt up over his head and says, "Are you threatening me?" It's just because it does. It feels like a threat. It's like, follow everything that we say as proxies standing in a spokesman of God, or else you will perish.
Death.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right there. People just can't argue that this is part and parcel of religion. They create this scarcity. They create this fear of death, spiritual or physical. Or of not being with your families, or of not being with Heavenly Father. And then they present themselves as the solution. And those are all arbitrary, by the way. Who says there's even a thing of spiritual death? Who says there's an afterlife? Who says there's multiple levels of heaven? Who says that God is going to keep you from him or her or they, if God even exists? Other Christian churches, you're just with your family. That's it. So who says there are all these deaths or limits or punishments or hells or judgments? It's the religion saying it. Oh, and by the way, how do you avoid all the death and the separation that the religion is telling you you're going to experience? By doing everything the religion says.
Yeah. And you'll notice they get to have their cake and eat it too. There's some doublespeak here. So yes, the church says that you have a celestial kingdom, and then the terrestrial and telestial kingdom, and any one of those is better than life here. And so you're set, you're good to go. And yet that's like one or two scriptures plus some prophets say every once in a while. A majority of the scriptures that talk about the afterlife are like Mosiah right here. Remember, and now, O man, remember and perish not. And they talk about hell, and they talk about the fires, and they talk about torture, and they talk about endless torment. scripture after scripture keeps driving home these ideas of eternal death over and over and over. But then when you say, oh, I'm scared of the Mormon afterlife, it's scary, they're trying to scare me, they can say, no, we've got the terrestrial and telestial kingdoms. They're just as good as the
People
celestial
would kill
kingdom
themselves to be a part of them. They're beautiful.
why don't you go, they get to have their double speak there. They get to instill the fear of death that we had as Mormons at the same time as they get to have their soft little afterlife. They get both.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And this notion of sad heaven, which is a real thing, is hurting the church in 2021, because there are all sorts of other voices out there saying heaven doesn't need to be sad. Heaven can be a happy, great place. And so there are a lot of people just saying all this stress and pressure of living the Mormon way is making me miserable, and my kids are falling away. No matter how hard I worked and tried, my kids are still choosing to leave the church. My spouse has now left the church, and the church is realizing that this totalistic, sad heaven theology is backfiring as more and more people become aware of the problems, choose to leave the church, or they come out as gay or lesbian or trans or a feminist, or they want to work or whatever it is. And Mormonism's having to backtrack and say, no, heaven's about love and happiness and don't judge. But now it's contradicting past prophets, the scriptures themselves, and it's become a real mess for the Mormon Church to try and manage all this.
Yeah. I hope they figure it out in a way that is beneficial to human beings that are a part of it and that are adjacent to it.
That's what this whole series is about, is helping people unpack and deprogram and live healthy lives, and maybe giving the church some tips to harm less people. I love it.
All right. So this is Gordon B. Hinckley. He's quoting something he once heard that was then quoted, but there's a lot of this in the church, people quoting, and there's like 3 layers deep of quotes. But anyway, so this was recently quoted by Marilyn and Merrill Bateman at a BYU devotional in 2003. So this isn't buried doctrine that no one talks about anymore. It's still brought up. And Gordon B. Hinckley said, I know what my mother, he's quoting someone who's at Vietnam. He says, I know what my mother expects. I know what she's saying in her prayers. She'd rather have me come home dead than unclean. And so my conclusion to that is the consequences, the spiritual consequences of screwing up within the LDS church are so harsh that death is preferable. So they can say all they want about the telestial and terrestrial kingdoms being pretty all right. And yet you have people who would rather come home in a body bag from Vietnam or from their mission than come home unclean.
And by the way, this is not just like a cherry picking of the worst possible quotes. My mission president shared this quote with all of us during our mission experience, when one elder, when some elders were sent home for doing bad things. And I've had many people on Mormon Stories that were shared, those quotes were shared with them. Parents have shared those quotes with their kids, saying, we'd rather you come home dead than unclean. This is not exaggeration. This is still part of Mormon culture. Yeah, absolutely true.
And then a quote from Pam Casimir in her internet memoir, Losing My Mind Bit by Bit. I thought that if I kept working hard, I'd earn God's peace. I was so focused on having eternal perspective that I lost perspective, the perspective that this life is worth living. I was living just to die soon and get admitted to the celestial kingdom where all those hardy, enduring souls got to go. And I can relate to that feeling. Like as a kid, I was like, yeah, if the celestial kingdom is so great that you die to get there, then yeah, and I remember at 6 years old, just like wanting to die. I wasn't going to kill myself or anything. Like I wasn't depressed particularly even. Like, I kind of probably was. I was bullied in school a little bit, but like, it was all about the promise of the celestial kingdom and how hard this life has to be. And you have to endure it, and you have to get through, and you have to be tempted and tested all the time. And it was just such a huge burden that Mormonism put on me. And even as a 6-year-old, I just wanted to get it over with. Like, kill me now, God. I prayed to God that he would kill me now. So, and then Pam had a much harder life. Her story is pretty harrowing. And that's how she felt as well.
Yeah. And this is why so many, again, just as one group, LGBT Q plus Mormons, they're told there's no theology for you in this life. There's no plan for you. You can't find love. You can't get married. You can't, live a healthy, fulfilling, meaningful life with someone you love and meaningfully participate in the church, which is the whole reason for your existence. And the only way you're going to be fixed or cured is in the afterlife. And so sometimes people, and that's not just true for LGBTQ plus people, it's also, Mormon youth who can't stop masturbating or who have premarital sex or who, for whatever reason, can't live the gospel. Far too many Mormons conclude, this life has not been fulfilling. I can't do it in this life. I may as well just hit the reset button, propel myself into the next life where maybe the healing is going to come, or maybe I'll be able to find love then, or maybe Heavenly Father will fix me then. And they actually terminate their lives with the hope that there will be a next life. And people these days, we don't really know if there's going to be a next life. So if this is the only life you have, what an incredible tragedy to have terminated it under a false scarcity, a false hope, a false promise that may or may not come true in the next life.
Yeah. And that's Pam's story. She's leading up there to the conclusion of her story where she did attempt suicide, and she was a Mormon housewife. She didn't even have the LGBT pressures. That was just the pressure on her to be a perfect super mom within the Mormon context. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have Mormon Stories interviewees all the time that have just buckled under perfectionism.
Yeah.
It's toxic.
It's harsh. It's harsh for everyone. Yeah.
So we have now completed dispensing of existence. And I think this is the plan of salvation. The plan of salvation has scarcity built right into it. Everything from death, physical death, spiritual death, Mormon version of hell, which is outer darkness, the 3 degrees of glory, which creates, in effect, certain types of death by being cut off from God, cut off from your family, cut off from your spouse, cut off from your children, potentially cast into outer darkness, to just the metaphorical spiritual death, dark and loathsome, the light's gone out of your eyes. You're going to be sad and sick and miserable if you leave the church, spiritual death. Unfortunately, Mormon theology and Mormon discourse gets an A+. I'm sad to say.
Yeah.
Which leaves us with the last one for today. No. There's two more.
Two more. Yeah.
Two more. Okay. So the penultimate one for today is double bind, which is a really good one. Let's talk about double bind.
All right, let's see if I can do this one. This one kind of baffles me, and I think if I was a narcissist or malignant narcissist or something, it would, but I always have to concentrate really hard to explain this, so hopefully I can. The easiest way to explain it is damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I have a Far Side cartoon here with the devil, and he's poking the guy, and there's one door says damned if you do, and the other door says damned if you don't. And devil's saying, come on, it's either one or the other. So it's a double bind is a compromising situation where either choice will bring unwanted results. And so it creates logical, emotional, and behavioral traps that we can get stuck in. And it's a lose-lose situation for the victim and always turns out to be a win-win situation for the manipulator. It deflects blame and attention away from the manipulator for the failed promises that they have and the abuses that they're committing. And it often leads to self-betrayal. That's usually the easiest way out of a double bind, is to betray yourself and go against your own, what your own heart is telling you, or what you know to be true, or what you would prefer to do with your life.
Yeah, and I think having some examples is going to really drive this home. So let's keep going.
Examples should help. So I want to talk a little bit about the dynamic of how the double bind works with, I think these 4 mind control techniques support each other. So you have a cycle between demand for purity, which sets up unrealistic expectations. So if you
don't have bad thoughts, don't sin, don't masturbate, don't do anything. Compliance. Don't look at porn, sexual purity.
Yeah.
Don't even have the thought. Don't dress in a way that's going to create the thought. Okay.
Exactly. So that creates unrealistic expectations because you're expecting some kind of reward for that. But usually those promises aren't fulfilled, and not everybody who obeys the commandments is happy all the time. And so blame reversal comes in to put the failures on you.
Well, also, no one can live up to all those standards.
No, you can't live up to it. So you're gonna slip up on something, and so it's automatically your fault. So blame reversal kicks in, and that generates guilt and shame. And so you've got all this guilt, and then it flips around to the double bind, which forces you to choose. When you have that choice, you're feeling, I feel like guilt. What is my way out? The double bind comes in and forces you to where your only out is to obey more.
Right. And so if you can't stop masturbating, if you can't stop looking at porn, if you can't live the law of chastity, if you can't dress modestly, if you mess up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and we just had a really
your genealogy perfectly, find every name of everyone who's ever, that is an endless task right there, a Sisyphean task that can never, because the records don't even exist for once you get to a certain point. And yet you can always fall short of doing your genealogy. Always. Just that one.
Yep. And that wonderful big old list that you have, that slide of like, the 500 things they don't tell you when you join the church of all the things you'll have to do. It just makes it so you're always on this hamster wheel of unworthiness and shame because you can't live up to it. What's the answer? Obey more, follow more, believe more, pay more. And it all accrues to the church's benefit, of course.
Yeah.
And to the detriment of your own mental health and well-being.
Exactly. And your family and the people around you. So I have a metaphor to try to get this one over. We will have some actual examples within the church, but here's a metaphor. So you get a flyer and it talks about a happy hyperspace light years delivery service that promises co-op vacations. They're so wonderful that nobody even comes home from them. So there aren't even any testimonials because no one's ever come back. That's how amazing the trip is. So you sign up. You hand over all your wealth to get on a spaceship. And you're in the spaceship, you're in this rocket, and you're flying through space, and you're expecting to punch into hyperspace drive any minute so you can go fast enough to travel the vast distances of space. But you're still traveling at sublight speeds, and you're not getting any faster. So there's a help button on the dash, and you push it. And the little computer screen pops up and says, "Mechanical difficulties, please stand by." And then it prints out, and this old printer out comes all of these complicated instructions. And there are contradictions in the instructions. It says to cut the red wire. And then the next part says never, ever, ever cut the red wire. And you should cut the blue wire. And so you're not sure, and you're tangled in wires, and you've got your wire clippers, and you just like, I think it says to cut the blue wire. And so you cut the blue wire, and immediately a technician comes on. "Why did you cut the blue wire? You have just broken your ship. How could you possibly break your ship? And you've been traveling for a week at sublight speeds. You are out of fuel, and it's your fault." And so you're like, well, now what do I do? And the technician presses a button, and a panel opens up in the wall of the ship, and there are pedals. And the technician says, well, now because you've broken the ship, you got to pedal the rest of the way. And you better pedal hard because you've got a long way to go. And so you start pedaling hard, and you're pedaling hard, and the pedals are cheap and they break. And then now the technician is yelling at you because you pedaled too hard. That is like an example. And the story that I tell in my book has more little nuances and stuff about your adventure on the spaceship. But it's kind of an example of what we do when we're in Mormonism. When we try too hard, we've tried too hard, and now we're depressed and broken, and that's our fault. And if we don't try hard enough, then that's our fault. And if we, preach the gospel too hard, then we turn a bunch of people off from the church, then that's our fault. And we don't preach the gospel, and we're insincere to our friends. We've got more examples coming up, but now we're insincere to our friends because we've been preaching the gospel to them, and now that we don't want them to be our friends anymore. All of these little double binds where neither choice gets us what we want or what we have promised.
And what's really hard about this is the teachings of Jesus are viewed so sacredly and is so core and central to Mormonism. And the atonement is viewed as the most special and beautiful and sacred part of all Mormonism. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, for Mormonism, this hamster wheel of unworthiness and guilt and shame has been interwoven into the Mormon version of Christology and atonement theology, so that you're always hustling for your worth and for forgiveness, and you're always hustling for repentance. And is it God that you directly repent to, or Jesus that you directly repent to? No, you always need the bishop or the Mormon Church as the intermediary between you and God. and it becomes very, very toxic.
Yeah, we'll
and
actually talk about that
self-serving.
in the Cult of Confession. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's some examples of some double binds within Mormonism. And another way to describe a double bind is the answer is yes, but, and then the but always means no. And so, am I free to leave Mormonism? Yes, of course you are. But can I choose for myself? Yes, but will the gospel make me happy? Yes, but is the church good for families? Yes, but will God answer my prayers? Yes, but will I be blessed in this life? Yes, but, and do other faiths have the truth? Yes, but. And we can list all kinds of things. There's always a catch. There's always a double speak. There's always a way that the church can get the benefit of the answer being either yes or the answer being yes, but. But the answer is never no. They're not going to say, no, you're not free to leave. You're stuck here forever. And they're not going to admit that if you leave, you're going to maybe lose your family. You're going to lose your sense of identity. You're going to lose your community. You might lose your job. They don't talk about any of that.
If the patriarchal blessing comes true, well, then the church is inspired. If it doesn't, then you weren't living worthy. If the priesthood blessing works, then wow, isn't God's priesthood power miraculous? If it doesn't work, well, either the blessing giver or the blessing receiver weren't worthy enough. So church always wins somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we got some quotes from some of the researchers describing this dynamic. Although they didn't use this name. I got this name from Marian Stricker, who is an ex-Mormon. But Tobias and Lalich in Captive Hearts and Captive Minds said, when this type of manipulation is used, cult members spend most of their time feeling as though they are walking on eggs, knowing that they must act, yet to act may bring rebuke, punishment, or worse. And then somewhere else in the book, they said, it therefore becomes easier to rationalize the leader's behavior as necessary for the general or individual good. The alternative of the devotee would be to face the sudden and overwhelming awareness of being victimized, deceived, and used. Such a realization would wound the person's deepest sense of self, so as a means of self-protection, the person denies the abuse. When and if the devotee becomes aware of the exploitation, it feels as though a tremendous evil has been done, a spiritual rape. So that's kind of the situation that double binds put us in. Again, these work in domestic abuse as well. And so I had those situations with my abuser where I was supposed to do this, but I knew from his reactions that if I did that, then this would happen. So I had to choose between two bad outcomes. Neither one was good. And I did end up sacrificing a lot of myself because that was the easiest way to go. Just sacrifice my own needs. Don't bring anything up. Don't stir the pot. And it did feel like I was walking on eggshells. I'm
so sorry.
Oh, thank you. I'm hoping to help others with that knowledge. So that's why I'm so open about it. Yeah. I've seen it in the literature called the loyalty betrayal funnel. And so Michael D. Langoni in Recovery from Cults said, if members remain loyal to their own perceptions about self and the world, they betray the group on which they have become inordinately dependent. If they remain loyal to the group, they betray their own perception of what is real, good, and true. Dissent thus places members in a funnel from which there is no escape and which inevitably leads to betrayal, either of themselves or of the group.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Sounds familiar.
Yeah. We have some examples from scriptures. So there's a little cartoon of a guy and he's looking at two checkbox, and the empty checkbox says tick box to accept terms and conditions. And the other box is checked and it says untick box to not confirm unticking of previous box. And so we have some big ifs within the church. We've got a couple of scripture quotes. D&C 82:10. I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say, but when you do not what I say, ye have no promise. That's a really big if right there, given the demand for purity and the list of commandments that we will never be able to complete. And then Moroni 10:4. Yeah, exactly. Moroni 10:4, if ye shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. And the implied, if not, then if you don't have enough faith, then you won't get the answer, and then it's all on you again.
And who's to say what's sincere and what is real and what is faith and ultimately, unless you agree, you got the right answer if your answer agrees with what the answer the church wanted you to receive. Mm-hmm. If you receive any other answer or you don't get your answer, you are clearly doing it wrong.
Right. Exactly. Yeah,
So
that double bind, converting
keep
it.
doing it until you get the right answer, right?
Right. And it converts every situation to the benefit of the church and the detriment of you, unless you're already going to do that. And then it's not to your detriment. And then it's not a double bind. And so there are exceptions for individuals for whom specific commandments or parts of the church, if you pray and you read the Book of Mormon and you get the answer right away that the church is true, then good job. You avoided the double bind because you weren't in conflict with what the church needed you to do. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We have another quote from 1 Corinthians, which summed up says, if we fail to receive the promised blessings, it is our failing. And the scripture reads, God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. And what if that isn't true? And what if we can be tempted more than we can bear? What if there is no escape? How does that make us feel when we're told we won't be tempted above what we're able, and then we are tempted above what we are able, or we're going through such pain and torment that we can't? And the fact that suicide exists is, I think, proof against this scripture. Suicide happens when it hurts so bad that you cannot bear it anymore, and your only escape is death. And I have a picture of an escape room and a caption. I wrote a caption, like an escape room where all the puzzles have no solutions.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's dark, and that's a really heinous kind of quote. And I'm really glad you emphasized it, because clearly life gives people all sorts of, people have mental breaks. People end up in behavioral health units. People attempt suicide, or they successfully complete suicide, and they have mental breakdowns. And guess what? Psychologists and psychiatrists in Utah are 6 months out. They're so busy, and the unis are full of people who have to commit themselves to an institution before they die prematurely. And people are super depressed and self-medicating in all sorts of horrible ways. Like just death by suicide is an extreme. How about all the people that simply can't endure without self-medicating through food or through distractions or through drugs or alcohol or unhealthy forms of sex or coping? There are all sorts of ways that people are not able to endure.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's a few more specific examples from the church. On the next slide, if you have friends outside the church, you are pressured to try to convert them. If you cannot convert them and remain friends, then they may set a bad example for you or distract from your church duties. If you stop spending time with them, your friendship was insincere. So there's no way to win from that by having friends outside the church. If you can't convert them, sure. If you convert them, then everything lines up and you win. You get to still be friends with them, but you won't have time to be friends with them if they don't convert. And then that's a betrayal of yourself, because then you may feel like your friendship was like you were faking the friendship. If you don't go on a mission, you will let God down, you will be shamed by your family, and you will let souls suffer in unbelief. If you do go, you go against your own goals in schooling, career, and relationship. If you're trans or gay, you can deny yourself healthy, fulfilling relationships or self-expression while still being more or less accepted by your family, friends, and the church, or you can be yourself and be utterly rejected. If you don't have a testimony, you have to bear it anyway, and you feel like a liar. So those are a couple of the situations that a lot of people are put into by the church that I consider to be double binds.
Yeah, there's so many. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we fortunately we have one of our believing listeners who has joined us, and we're always super glad when our believing listeners join us. And we have a question from him. So it's a question from Dan. I'm going to put the question up on the screen, and I'm going to read it. And then Luna, I'm going to have you respond, and then I'll maybe respond too. Okay. Thanks for reaching out, Dan. We're glad you're joining us. We don't want groupthink here. We want critiques, we want questions, we want criticisms, we want debate, because we have to live the principles that we say we believe in. So Dan's question, I'm confused. For the question, am I free to leave? You are saying that the church says yes, but the church doesn't tell you that you can lose your family or that you could lose X, Y, or Z. But I've seen other podcasts where John tells viewers that the church tells its members that if they leave, they will lose their family, etc., as a scare tactic. Again, I'm confused. The church tells us that we will lose everything if we leave? Question mark. That's option one. Or the church doesn't tell us that we will lose anything when we leave? Question mark. Getting two different messages here from you guys, depending on the podcast. Now, Luna, I guess it's not your job to answer for what Dan thinks I've said in other podcasts, but I do want to give you the first chance at responding.
Well, it's kind of the nature of the double bind, right? The church can say loving and kind and everyone's has freedom and free agency is core to our gospel. They can say that, and then they can say, quote, Messiah again, and now, O man, remember and perish not. If you do not observe the commandments of God and continue in the faith of what you have heard concerning the coming of our Lord, even unto the end of your lives, you must perish. So the church can say that. They can threaten you with death on the one hand, if you don't do what they say God says, or they can tell you on another day that you have free agency and you can leave the church, you can stay in the church, whatever you want. But neither of those two statements erases the actual consequences of leaving the church, which we all knew when we were in the church. We knew that we risked disapproval from our family. Maybe our family wouldn't shun us outright, but we knew that they weren't going to like it very much. We were going to get that social pressure. We knew we were told that we would fall into a life of sin. We were told that we would fall into Satan's power. We were told all of that. And that's the core of doublespeak, is the church can pull out a quote that supports anything in any topic of the day in the moment, any point that they want to make in the moment, they can pull out a quote and do it. And so when we're addressing all of that contradictory doublethink, we have to address it, and we have to address each one. We have to point to it and say, there's that one and there's that one. It's not us that's doing the contradiction. It's the church that's doing it. And that's kind of the basic element of what a double bind actually is it's all to the benefit of the church and all a lose-lose situation for those who don't follow the church's commandments 100%.
Yeah, and that was a beautiful response. And I'll just say, Dan, yes, you're confused and I'm confused. And my answer would be, yes, it's doublespeak. The Mormon Church theology wants to have it all ways. Heavenly Father loves you, and he's your loving Father that wants the best for you. And if you don't do everything he says, you're going to be cast out to outer darkness or not be able to live with him someday. It's both. Jesus is loving and kind and sweet and peaceful and patient, and he's overturning the tables, and he's going to come back in the second coming and like burn and torture everyone in the, you know, in the second coming. You know, if you go read Revelation theology, he's going to burn everyone who doesn't do and say what they're supposed to do. You know, the atonement, Jesus loves you, and you can, you know, we will be patient with you, and everyone can, you know, make their free agency and do what they say. And if you don't do everything the church says, you're going to be punished and kicked out and ostracized and marginalized, and you're dirty, and you're like a chewed piece of gum, and you're like a licked cupcake. And the atonement makes you clean, and bishops are going to be able to ask you about your sins for years and years and years afterwards if you get caught in that shame parade, and they can ask you again and again and again to repent for things you've already repented for. Like, that's part of it, Dan, is that the church wants to be able to use any tool at any time, whichever way it wants, to keep you bound to it. And so there's going to be a good cop, bad cop dynamic of love and kindness and acceptance and universality and fear and shame and guilt and punishment. It's all there to be used however the church wants to keep as many people committed to it as possible.
Yep. Hopefully that answers your question, Dan. I hope I understood your question well enough and was able to answer to your satisfaction.
And Dan, we're so glad you're here. Please give us your best critiques. We want you to critique us, and not just Dan, other listeners as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. More on the double bind.
Yeah. So here's another double bind. The Spirit will help you choose the right, but you can only have the Spirit if you prove you are worthy by choosing the right. So you're kind of stuck in that. So I don't know how that is supposed to work. Like, if you commit one sin once, is that you're done with the Spirit, and the Spirit will never help you choose the right again. I'm not really sure. And when you think about it, when I think about it, it kind of starts to fall apart. Baptism is a two-way covenant, but if you think about the sacrament prayer, we keep the commandments, and God's promises will have the Spirit to help us keep the commandments. That's all we get. That and some invisible stuff in the afterlife that we don't know. There's no way to prove whether or not we're actually going to get that. And it turns all choices into being about the church or God, or the church standing in for God at all times. And we actually, in the end, get nothing from the deal.
This is such a brilliant point you're raising, Luna, because if we had the Spirit to begin with, why did we ever say or do anything bad? If the Spirit really means something, if having the Spirit really affects your thoughts and behavior, then you would never do anything bad. But then also, if we do something bad, don't we need the Spirit more? Why isn't the Spirit helping us when we need it most? If we've had a bad thought, made a bad decision, why isn't that when a loving Heavenly Father would say, oh my gosh, my child, you've sinned, you've made a mistake. I'm not going to withdraw the Spirit so that just to add severity and pain, rub salt in your wound. I'm going to give you the Spirit that's going to help you heal and correct and do better. What does it even mean, this Spirit, at the end of the day? If you really think about it, the church's teachings about the Holy Ghost are at best confusing, and at worst they're inhumane and evil, right?
Yeah,
mean.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the more I learn, the more perspective I get on that, and just the more obvious it becomes to me, I guess. So I have a quote from Martha Beck's memoir, Leaving the Saints. She left Mormonism. Really good memoir. I enjoyed it. So she says, utterly confused is exactly how I felt most of the time I was Mormon. Before you accept any religious claim, you must scrutinize it to see if you really believe it's true. However, if it's an official church doctrine and you feel it isn't true, this is the work of a sloppy soul, or worse, the devil. On the other hand, if you accept the advice of a church leader, which then turns out to be wrong, it's your own fault for not discerning that in this particular case, the leader was mistaken. So we're supposed to obey, and unquestioningly, whether or not it's a good commandment or a bad commandment. But then if it turns out it was a bad commandment, and that comes to the public awareness of the church, well, then you should have had the Spirit and should have just known that it was a bad commandment. And so it's still your fault because you were obedient to a bad commandment. And then where's your faith get you? So having unquestioning, unwavering faith of a mustard seed that can move a mountain, and you have that, and sometimes even that becomes a double bind situation where you're getting in trouble for following too much.
Yeah.
And I have other examples of where following too much has gotten people in trouble in my book as well.
And Julie makes a slight little joke. She says, and don't forget that the all-powerful Spirit or Holy Ghost goes to bed at 11 p.m. So when we need it most, in those dark hours of the evening or morning, the Holy Ghost somehow loses all his power.
The Spirit must be aging, because he went to bed at midnight when I was a kid.
That's like grandparents, Yeah. All right. More on the double bind.
Yeah. So the double bind and blame reversal together both re-traumatize and re-victimize in cases of abuse, and itself is a form of abuse. So I have a quote again from Marianne Stricker. She wrote this pattern of the double bind in Mormonism. The bound is left with the implicit demand to intuit the intelligent higher mind of the binder as to when she should obey rules and when she should already know when rules are not necessary. When she follows the rules, she is guilty. When she doesn't follow the rules, she is also guilty. She walks on eggshells looking for a sign that would indicate in advance the binder's elusive whim. And when she wrote this book, she wasn't just writing about the church. She had also left an abusive marriage. And so when she talks about the binder, she's talking both about church leadership and about her ex-husband and the patterns that she saw within his behavior. And as an abuse survivor of a malignant narcissist who did a lot of mental abuse, I can also testify, if you will, to that dynamic existing in abusive relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that rounds out the discussion of double bind. And unfortunately, I have to give the Mormon Church an A again on the double bind, because I think you've laid the case out just very, very clearly.
All right.
We have a comment from Gerardo, my dear friend Gerardo. He writes, "It sounds to me like what Bednar did a couple conferences ago with food storage. Food storage had not been mentioned in general conference or over a conference, but then Bednar during COVID goes on general conference and says it's the members' fault for not being prepared." Yeah.
It's always your fault. It's always blame reversal and the double bind.
Thanks, Gerardo, for the comment. All right, this brings us to our last of the 31 flavors or the tools for undue influence. Cult of confession.
Yes.
And I think we already know. I think we already know the answer on this one.
The church actually isn't as bad on this one as a lot of other groups.
Not as bad as Scientology.
Not nearly. Scientology gets like an extra credit.
Gold star. Extra gold star.
Yeah. Now, the reason I have cult of in parentheses is because that's the original name that this one had given by Robert Lifton, who was probably the first or one of the first researchers into how mind control works. And so when he named this one, he called it the cult of confession. And in my book, I think I just call it confession. So after all these demands and double binds and all this stuff going on, you got all this guilt and shame, you got this weight on your shoulders, and you got to unburden it to someone. And it's awfully convenient that the only one that the church offers you as a way to unburden yourself is the church itself. It destabilizes, reinforces guilt and shame and doctrine over self, and the overall message is submit. It is an act of submission when you go to someone who is in a position of authority under a commandment that you are supposed to do this, and you are revealing your soul to them, whether or not you personally trust them or not. That is an ultimate act of submission to them. All personal problems are routed through the church, so not just sins, but situations that can be embarrassing to the church, like sexual abuse or familial abuse, all has to go through the church to be dealt with the way that they want to deal with it. And the remedy for emotions or consequences always has to be LDS approved. So if you think you might want to get a therapist who is following the current APA guidelines for a healthy and ethical therapeutic experience, you're not going to be told to just go to any secular therapist of your choosing that you find on the internet through Yelp reviews or through friends. You're going to be told to go to the church LDS services, which contradicts the APA guide for ethical and healthy therapeutic practices that's presently out there. And Natasha Helfer has talked quite a bit about that particular problem. And so even if you're just having marital problems or struggling with some spiritual issues or emotional or trauma, past trauma, you're still going to go to an LDS approved therapist who may or may not be following the recommended guidelines that science has offered us as the best way to deal with trauma, to not re-victimize or not continue to hurt the person. And cults of confession makes you dependent upon the group in order to be considered a good person. If you have sinned, in order to become clean again, you have to go through the church's outlined process of repentance, which involves talking to the bishop or the stake president. And they don't let you have any other path to absolution. There's no other options with that. It is literally a prescribed pathway to repentance that the church offers you.
Yeah, and you're going to talk about this more in just a second, but there's so many things that confession does. It puts you in a down-powered position of weakness. It elevates your leader as not only being above you, but in Mormonism, it places the leaders between you and God. So there is no direct worship of God and direct relationship with Jesus. It's the church that you have the relationship with. And of course, the church is going to tell you, what's the way that you're going to get better? Well, pray, read your scriptures, fast, pay a generous fast offerings, pay a generous tithing, serve in your calling, do everything we tell you, be obedient. And that's just wrong for so many reasons. It's self-serving for the church. And, what's worse is, that advice isn't necessarily going to help you if you're depressed or if you have obsessive compulsive disorder or an eating disorder or unhealthy coping. the bishops aren't trained to help with mental health stuff. And it's worse because the church either demonizes historically the mental health profession. Bruce R. McConkie did it. Most church leaders have done it, or they redirect people to unethical mental health practitioners who, again, are going to say the solution to your depression is more righteousness. The solution to being gay is to go to North Star or Evergreen or do reparative or conversion therapy. They're going to recommend unethical or non-evidence-based solutions to the problem, and it's going to just harm you more or put you under subjective service to the church and prolong your health and well-being. It's unethical on basically every level, which then makes total sense why the church excommunicates Natasha Helfer Parker and, frankly, me. I was telling LGBT people they needed to come out as LGBT, live their full authentic life, get same-sex married if they want to, and that's going to lead to the most health. I was doing that as a psychology PhD, and they excommunicated me for giving that recommendation.
Mm-hmm. And I always think of the stories that I've read online over and over, and in a couple of memoirs that I've read about the child who is sexually abused by a family member or someone in the ward. This happens over and over and over. It's like such a stereotypical story. And they go into the church, they go to the bishop like they're supposed to, and they're seeking help, and they're seeking comfort and help from, they've been victimized. And then the bishop does some form of victim blaming from the very mild on up to the full on, you were completely culpable and it must have been something you did, somewhere in that range of blaming the victim for their sexual abuse, which any therapist is going to know, any ethical therapist on the planet is going to know is going to re-traumatize you and is going to make your PTSD a lot worse. And then the bishop time and time again doesn't call the authorities. Sometimes they do, but usually they don't. They might call the church. And of course, the church is just going to pull in their lawyer arm so they can get a settlement. And this happens time and time again. I saw a tweet the other day that pointed out that settlements for sexual abuses, this wasn't about Mormonism, this was our society's tendency to just settle out of sexual abuse complaints, is just a form of sex trafficking. It's just a person getting caught, and so they pay their way out of it. How is that different from them just paying a lot of money to have sex with someone against their will? Like that is what those settlements sort of end up being. And then the person gets a gag order and then they can't talk about it. And if they want to get their settlement, and then that's that. And the church's way of handling that tends to be re-traumatizing and victimizing, which are concepts that I don't even have a degree in psychology. I just read a lot of books, and I know that you never blame someone. Even if they had some small part, that is not the time to talk about that, not the time to point that out or anything, because if you do at that precious time when they're still raw, which can still be years later, you're going to hurt the crap out of them. You're just going to drive home that they deserved what happened to them and that it's all their fault. And that meanwhile, the perpetrator is completely out of the story. He's the guy that did it. And yet he isn't part of any of this. He's not getting punished. He might get a slap on the wrist. He might get called in and talked to, but they're going to believe every word that he says because they do time and time again. I'm really passionate about this topic. Can you tell? Like, this is the thing that still gets me mad. Like, I have worked out so much of my anger about the church, but this is the button and you can push it and I will get mad and mad and mad and mad about this because the church is excusing and covering up and enabling abusers throughout the church. And I hate it. I can't stand it. This is the worst part of it.
Yeah, and we've got some pushback from our favorite believer. Dan Hardy writes, LDS Social Services is simply a free service for those who want to take advantage of the service. Members are not told to avoid professional therapists.
Depends on your bishop.
What's that?
It depends on your bishop. Some bishops will say, go find a therapist, and other bishops will point you to LDS services and say you have to get one of them.
And Dan Hardy, what you are not being honest about intentionally, or what you're just unaware of, is the decades and decades and decades of Bruce R. McConkie, Mormon doctrine, Mormon church leaders discouraging seeing psychologists and psychiatrists, denouncing the professions of psychology or psychiatry, of privileging counseling with the bishop over mental health professionals, of not training their bishops to be mental health counselors. So we're talking about all the gay people that went to bishops to try and ungay themselves, all the depressed people that who had like clinical bipolar depression, where the bishop is saying repent or read the scriptures, where he should be saying go find a therapist. But there has been a lot of denouncing. And then when mental health professionals are encouraged, there is absolutely a funnel where members are funneled to church-approved mental health professionals that are going to give you the church-approved guidelines, which are often contradictory to the best science and the best mental health professional guidelines. The classic example of that, Dan Hardy, is when Natasha Elfer Parker was teaching that masturbation is healthy and normal, nothing to be ashamed of. Then Mormon church leaders started discouraging members in the Kansas area from going to Natasha, to going to mental health professionals that are church approved, that are going to say that masturbation is an addiction, that masturbation is like a drug addiction, and that you need to go to a 12-step program, addiction recovery program, to treat your masturbation as an addiction, which no competent mental health professional is going to ever do. And so they're funneling people to addiction recovery programs instead of to licensed competent sex therapists or mental health therapists. Not to mention, again, the LGBT stuff. Gerardo's sharing with us, while my husband was going, and Gerardo's gay, so it's talking about his gay male husband. While my husband was going to BYU, Idaho, he needed a therapist really bad. After panic attacks, while going through a faith crisis, his mom told him if he wanted to use the family's insurance, he had to go through LDS Family Services. Also, when the bishop frees up fast offering money to be used for mental health professionals, they can only be mental health professionals, not of the choosing of the member, but they have to be funneled through bishop-approved LDS Family Services. I just want to say, Dan Hardy, you are not giving an honest account of what happens within the church in the mental health world.
I think he's being honest. I think that's just his experience.
Yeah, it's his experience.
I think that that's valid because, again, the church has these ways where it depends on, it's what they call clergy roulette. Like what's your bishop's particular individual attitude towards modern mental health services, and what is your family's relationship to that? So I grew up, my mom was interested in psychology as a kid. There were self-help books secular self-help books laying around the house. My sister was really interested in psychology. And so she was learning all this stuff and talking about it all the time. And therapy was approved. That wasn't something that was stigmatized or anything in my particular family growing up. And so, there I was, a 19-year-old newly divorced single parent. And, I went to therapy, but I still picked a Mormon therapist. He wasn't through LDS Family Services, but I picked that because that's who I had been taught to trust. But then I couldn't afford it. And I went to Codependence Anonymous, which was a 12-step group for various types of relationship and personal self-help kind of healthiness issues. And I learned so much stuff in CODA. If I had not gone to CODA, I probably never would have left the church, because it taught things like it doesn't matter who your higher power is. It just matters that it could be the universe. It could be just fate or some kind of secular idea of higher power. And that's okay. What I learned was that the point wasn't that you worship God the Father, Yahweh. The point is that you have someone that you can lean into, a spiritual being that you can sort of lean into, and that is the point. And I learned a lot of other people's faith experiences from other religions, and they happen to be similar to Mormonism, so that kind of lowered the importance. But so see, it is a threat to Mormons' mind bubble when people do learn these secular ideas, and Mormonism knows that, the leaders do. And so having mixed advice to people, at least they're going to throw some of those seeds out and it's going to hit fertile ground, and enough people are going to avoid secular, modern, therapeutic things that it's going to help the church in general. But there are examples where, like me, where we were totally cool with therapy. It just depends.
Absolutely. So and if you Gerardo shares some of the guidance in the Church Handbook of Instructions. So, for example, homosexual behavior and same-gender attraction. And again, same-gender attraction that term would never be used in the competent mental health, profession. It's being gay, it's being lesbian, it's being bisexual. It's not same-gender attraction. That in and of itself is a non-evidence-based, offensive, unuseful term in the mental health world. But anyway, it says, in addition to the inspired help of church leaders, and by the way, they're not competent mental health professionals, especially around LGBTQ issues. It says members may need professional counseling. Okay, so they do say counseling. Let's see what type of counseling. In the United States and Canada, stake presidents and bishops may contact LDS Family Services to identify resources to provide such counseling in harmony with gospel principles, which means those therapists view same-sex attraction, as they call it, as a sin, as bad, as being against the church principles, which means that it's something they need to either become celibate about or around or enter into a mixed orientation marriage. Both of those choices being literally damaging to your mental health and well-being. But that's what a church-approved therapist is going to recommend. You're never going to find a church-approved therapist that's going to say, oh, go find your partner, fall in love with them if they're of the same gender, and go get same-sex married and live a happy, healthy life. If a bishop finds out that that's what a therapist, LDS Family Services therapist, is recommending, number one, they're going to complain to LDS Family Services, and number two, they're going to stop recommending that person. And that's just the way that it works. And there are other examples as well. Carol writes, I was a 17-year-old pregnant active woman. I went to a therapy group, an individual, twice a week, and I'm just starting to unpack the trauma of this therapy. It was just a place to shame you into placing your child for adoption. It was abusive on so many levels. I was indoctrinated as a pregnant teen for 8 months, twice a week, and it was very unethical. Carol, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Gerardo, please give our love to Zach for what happened to him. And yes, for so long, the Mormon Church wanted to offer adoption services so that these affluent, well-connected, wealthy, married couples that couldn't have kids could get kids through the church, which would make them super grateful to the church. So they would pressure these teenage girls to give up their children for adoption so that these other wealthy, affluent church members could have and raise kids in a home that would make sure that these kids would become active, faithful, tithe-paying Mormons. It was an awful racket that I'm grateful to see that the church has sort of divested itself of for legal and liability reasons. And there were some positive things that happened too. But all I'm saying is Dan, yes, you've had your experiences, but the church has been a disaster when it comes to mental health professionals. And if you don't believe me, ask the hundreds and hundreds of licensed mental health professionals that signed the letter supporting Natasha Helfer, condemning the way that the church has handled Natasha Helfer and the mental health profession. And then I'll just say one last thing. We all know about the 1-800 hotline that was given to bishops for victims of sexual abuse. And we all know that that hotline did not go to licensed, competent, independent mental health professionals. It literally went to Curtin and McConkie, where the advice wasn't given on how to protect and heal the victims. It was literally advice to help the bishops avoid any liability on behalf of the church, which included recommending to the bishops that they tell their parishioners not to go to law enforcement authorities to report the abuse. And of course, Mormon bishops in Utah are not mandatory abuse reporters. And so much abuse just goes unreported. It's a nightmare. And Luna, obviously, I share your passion on this.
Yeah. And I just want to be clear that because there are unhealthy, unethical therapists, even outside Mormonism, that the way that you judge that or discern that is that an ethical therapist is going to help you discover what you want and you need. And so if you're gay and you're Mormon and you have your belief and you're getting a lot out of Mormonism, but you also want to have a fulfilling relationship, they're not going to just tell you, leave the church and go get married. Like if they do that, they're not being an ethical therapist. They're not following their training. An ethical therapist will help you explore that space. And through that exploration, you will have freedom to consider all of your options, including staying in the church and remaining celibate, including entering a mixed orientation marriage, including leaving the church entirely and going off and getting married and settling down. Like they're gonna help you listen to your own inner voice on whatever the subject is. That is what an ethical therapist does. If a therapist is trying to make you stay in the church, that is unethical. If a therapist is trying to get you to leave the church, that is unethical. But if through the process of therapy you discover that you want to stay in the church or that you want to leave the church, that is ethical therapy. Oh, I can't hear you. I can't hear you, John.
Amen. Absolutely. All right. Well,
All
we
right.
could talk about this. This deserves
can
its
go
own
on.
podcast series,
Probably.
but let's continue with confession and why it's unhealthy.
All right. So I want to point out that confession itself is not unhealthy. What is unhealthy when it's a forced confession or one that you are highly pressured into doing to a person who you haven't chosen. So that is an unhealthy confession. And also when you getting confessing and counseling with an untrained lay person who is in authority over you, that can be psychologically dangerous. Now, if you're confessing to a friend, someone that you have chosen to trust because you feel good about that and you want to unburden yourself, it doesn't matter in that situation nearly as much that they're just a lay person who doesn't have counseling training, because it's self-directed. It's from you. And most importantly, you're of equal power or relatively equal power. They're not in a position of authority over you, where, for instance, they can point and say, you're in spiritual danger if you choose this or if you don't choose that. So the problem is when they are a lay person and they are in authority over you, that creates a really bad mix for where some psychological damage can be done. In the cult of confession, regardless of the organization, the sins aren't actually forgiven and forgotten. And when we read ex-Mormon accounts, we can find a lot of people who found out that they had confessed their sin and found out later that the church or the bishop or whoever it was had not actually forgiven and forgotten their sins. I have my own story where I'd done some really super tame sexual stuff, like not even foreplay, just like super tame. But I felt I needed to confess it. So I went to the bishop and I confessed it, and I got voluntarily disfellowshipped and did my little thing where I abstained from the sacrament and couldn't pray and stuff like that for a couple of months. And then free and clear. So then I go in to get a temple recommend, and I'm talking to the counselor, state counselor, and he's like, have you had any sexual sins? And I have a hard time, like, I'm really like freaking transparent. And so I'm like, yeah, but I repented of them, right? So I'm thinking I'm free and clear. He wanted to know every freaking detail. And I swear to God, he was getting off on it. Like, he wanted to know how it felt and exactly what I did and exactly what he did and exactly everything. He wanted to know every little nuance. And I got super creep vibes from this guy that he was like, and I'm like, wasn't I forgiven? Why am I having to reiterate this stuff? And the fact of the matter is, I think that guy was just a creep and he just wanted to get off vicariously through me. And that is an example of how the confession can be abused by someone who is in a position of authority that you don't have a choice over. I didn't get to choose which state counselor I was meeting with. So that's like an example of, and I've heard worse stories. My story is very tame in comparison to some of the stories where they pull up past stuff and use it against you in bishopric or state presidency. In more severe cults that are not Mormonism, that are worse than Mormonism, confessions are often public and made in front of the entire congregation, or they're recorded and later used against people. So Scientology is a really great example. You have hours and hours and hours and hours, and they pressure you, and it's like an interrogation, and they're recording all of it, and they have dirt against you that they can use against you. In most cases, I don't think the church goes quite that far, although in excommunications where it's over political dissent or ideological dissent, then they often, I think, do pull up past material. Those are other people's stories to tell, and they have told them. And the thing about confession is it works as both a deterrent and a punishment. So within this context, it is about control. It is not about unburdening yourself or being able to breathe easier or getting validation. You know, if you're talking to a friend and you're telling them something bad that you did, part of that is getting that validation of that sense of I am still a good person, and helping to sort out the morality of it, and helping to sort out how you can make amends for it and how you can avoid doing that in the future. That's what a healthy confession looks like. And in Mormonism, it isn't always that healthy.
Yeah, and one example of where this really gets ugly is in all the consequences that come from confession. So it can be just the bishop's disapproval, to being told you can't take the sacrament, which means that all your friends and your family and everyone around you sees that you're not taking the sacrament, so that, you know, you're perceived as a sinner. It's not being able to bless or pass the sacrament if you're a young boy. It's being kept out of baptisms for the dead in the temple, or being kept out of being able to go to the temple because you're unclean. It's being kept from attending the weddings of family members. It's being kept out of BYU, not being allowed to go to BYU, not being allowed to go on a mission, getting sent home early from your mission.
They tell the top leaders too in the church, right? Don't they tell like the Relief Society president and everybody, like, don't call on them, don't call on them to pray because they'll have to say no. And then if the person calls on you and they didn't happen to get the word down the line and they call on you to pray, then you've got to sit there and go, I can't, cause I don't know, cause I can't, you know, like it's shameful. You're stuck in a shameful situation there.
Yeah. There's just, you know, and again, getting sent home from a mission, how humiliating. Yeah. Being denied the ability to go to to get married in the temple, or to have your temple wedding date postponed, where everybody, oh, well, look, I thought it was August 4th. Oh, now it's December. Well, the couple must have done something wrong because now they're changing their wedding date. There are just so many ways. And then let's not forget, you go to BYU, one of the BYU schools, you confess to your bishop, you can literally get suspended and or kicked out of your university experience just for being honest with your ecclesiastical leader because of the honor code rules and the honor code violations and that sort of thing. And that can add 1 to 2 years on to your education as you have to transfer to a different school, sometimes mid-semester, sometimes lose out on credits that didn't get transferred. There are just so many ways that this confession practice within Mormonism becomes abusive and to the detriment of the member.
Yep, definitely.
Absolutely.
So we have some quotes, just so you know, I'm not making it up. We have John D. Goldhammer from Under the Influence, who says, confession in a destructive group milieu implies forgiveness, which means the core authority in an organization becomes the judge and jury over one's existence. This existential control gives groups limitless power and control over individuals who surrender themselves. So it ties into dispensation of existence a little bit. If you're afraid that your eternal salvation is contingent upon this whole confession process, that's a lot of authority. That is a super loaded amount of power that person has over you.
Mormon bishops are literally called judges in Israel, right? Yep. That's literally part of their job description.
Yep. And John Goldhammer wasn't Mormon. He had nothing to do with Mormonism. So, and then Marianne Stricker, she was an ex-Mormon. She says the binder causes the bound to be evil, punishes the bound for being evil, then steps in to become the comforter who forgives upon the bound's confession of guilt. After all, if the bound had been completely obedient, punishment would not have been necessary. Therefore, the bound, quote unquote, asked for it.
Just way too much power to put yourself between somebody and their God. It's just way too much power.
Yeah, definitely. Tobias and Lalich in Captive Hearts, Captive Minds said an active surrender of total exposure. The individual is now owned by the group. The person no longer has a sense of balance between worth and humility, and there's a loss of boundaries between what is secret, known only to the inner self, and what is known to the group. And Margaret Thaler, singer from Cults in Our Midst, said, purge and merge. The information gained about you can be used against you to make you feel more guilty, powerless, fearful, and ultimately in need of the cult and the leader's goodness.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So in Mormonism, we were always confessing in our hearts to God who was always watching us. We had no right to privacy. The angels were writing our names down in books that were going to be shouted from the rooftops at the end times, and at the judgment bar, all would be made known, and every little jot and tittle would be made known, and we would be just buried in shame. And that removed our sense of personal space and boundaries in general, which is really helpful for abusers of all types. So not just the leadership of the church, but any given abuser who is in the congregation or in your family, they have a ready and groomed victim just waiting to be abused and taken advantage of. And all they have to do is do it. And they know that the whole system and support of the church is going to support them over the victim, especially if the victim is female or a child, or LGBT, or not seen, or poor, or of color, or not seen as just like that bishop, that white male bishop up there on the pulpit. Robert J. Lifton said, each person becomes caught up in a continuous conflict over which secrets to preserve and which to surrender, over ways to reveal lesser secrets in order to protect more important ones. His own boundaries between the secret and the known, between the public and the private, becomes blurred. So that's the result of it. It is a way of grooming us to lose ourselves and lose our sense of self and our strength, our empowerment, our ability to make decisions for ourselves. And it grooms us to be willing to hand that over to anyone who asks.
Not to mention what we've highlighted many, many times in Mormon Stories, which is the lesson to lie. Because of all the shame and the risk involved in a combination of this confession culture with this punitive purity culture, so many Mormon youth and young adults just learn to lie because they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want the punishment. So what a messed up thing it is when your religion is literally grooming you to become deceptive and to have this duplicitous double life where you project health and healing, but then you've got this secret self that you're ashamed about and you're hiding it from everybody. It sets people up for awful marriages and awful mental health in adulthood sometimes.
It's that double bind. It's that you can be yourself and be ashamed and hide it all the time, or you can conform to the group and lie and not be inauthentic and get approval and get a pat on the head for doing all of that. And it's a double bind. And either way, you're not being authentic, and you're stuck.
Yeah.
So confession works as both a deterrent and a punishment. So in the New Era in 1989, someone wrote in, I went through a period when I had been involved in some bad things that I knew required a confession to the bishop. I was very fearful of going through with what I knew was right. Instead of just confessing, I quit going to church because I didn't feel comfortable there. I quit praying because I felt unworthy. I got involved in other more serious activities, which would also require a confession. And I can relate to that feeling of being so ashamed and worried that I wasn't over my thoughts. Like I wasn't even doing anything. I was just having thoughts, and I was so ashamed. I didn't want to go to the bishop. And then I felt like a liar, and I felt like God knew that I wasn't doing it right. And there was that thing of like, well, if I ever acted on any sin where I crossed a line, then it would be so overwhelming that I just may as well go out and do every sin. Like I've already, you're either in Satan's grasp or you're not. And if I'm in Satan's grasp, I may as well have a lot of fun doing that. And I
let loose, right?
Exactly. And I've seen that dynamic in writings of ex-Mormons over and over. And that's again, a double bind that you get stuck in. And it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then the church can point to you and in your heart, like, oh no, the church was right. I really did fall in the grasp of Satan because look, I did this one little thing. And next thing you know, I'm in an alley with a heroin needle sticking out of my arm, right? So, and then Jack B. Worthy from his memoir, The Mormon Cult, it's a missionary memoir, ex-Mormon. I've never had my peers sit in moral judgment of me before that day or since, and it felt strange. He had committed a sin on his mission, and everybody got in on it. And so he's sitting in judgment, and he says, only an indoctrinated prisoner would willingly allow such a thing. Now I was admitting to my sins to fellow missionaries, not as friends in confidence, but as judges.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One more quote from Stephen Hassan. Yeah.
Oh, we love Stephen Hassan on Mormon Stories.
Yep. Last quote. He says, the destruction of personal boundaries and the expectation that every thought, feeling, or action, past or present, that does not conform to the group's rules be shared or confessed. This information is not forgotten or forgiven, but rather used to control.
Yeah, and it's really heinous. And honestly, a shout out to Sam Young and his Protect LDS Children movement, because what Sam tried to do with the support of Natasha and me and others was just to say this whole worthiness interview concept is bankrupt. It's defective. And I would even go a little bit further. I think this atonement theology of you're fallen, you're dark, the natural man is an enemy to God. And so you need Jesus and you need the church and you need bishops to become clean. It's a hamster wheel of unworthiness that leads to poor mental health and really negative consequences and really bad marriages. It's meant to help people be on the straight and narrow and make good choices, but we need a better way to motivate positive behavior. And I'm going to say it's not through guilt and shame and confession and this kind of worthiness. Instead, what about a learning theology where it's just like, hey, when you're born, you don't know everything. And then as you get older, you start to learn stuff and you're going to trial and error and you're going to make some mistakes and you're going to make some good choices. And the good choices you'll learn from, the bad choices you'll learn from. And each day you try and do better. And then eventually, and you incorporate science and evidence and your own internal desires and knowledge of what your values are and what's right for you. And as you synthesize science and social science and the wisdom of your social circles, and most importantly, your own self-knowledge, you'll just learn to make better and better decisions. How healthier and preferable would that be to this fear-based, shame-based, hell-based, intimidation-based, confession grooming-based, deficit-based theology that is getting us nowhere good?
Yeah, with a demand for purity where watching a rated R movie is considered a huge sin. Like expanding your mind and learning more about the world and following a narrative of someone who's had a different background than you so that you can then empathize with other people who have that background. That is big sin. Like, no. And that's the other problem of it too, is what they are defining as wrong behavior is really, really misguided and for the church's benefit, not for our benefit. Me watching rated R movies has been a eye opener and it's been edifying for me. And I think it's made me a better person. And so choosing sins that are actual, things that harm other people, that's where I'm going to draw the line. And there's some nuance there. What is harm? What isn't? And how do we know what's harmful and isn't? There's some nuance, but there's most of it is pretty clear. If you kill someone, you're harming them. If you punch them in the face, you're harming them. And maybe it could be in self-defense. So that's one of the nuances. But generally speaking, you can use that as a guide. And to me, that ought to be the only things that we're considering sins, and then have a process of learning from it. And so you learn how to not harm yourself and others. That's my guide.
Yeah, and I'm just not even crazy about the concept of sin. Yes, I believe that the behavior that there can be harmful behavior, harmful to yourself, harmful to other people. But why load the language? Right. Why charge it up with sin and hell and judgment and condemnation and purity and filthiness? Why not just say, hey, when you know better, you do better? That's what Maya Angelou said. When you know better, you do better. Why can't it just be that?
Yeah, exactly. And I was using sin as a stand-in word. I don't use it generally either. But if you had a religion and needed to call it sin, those are the things that I would put in that bucket.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we made it to the end of today's presentation.
We did it.
We did it.
Yeah.
And, by the way, I mean, in terms of a grade on the church for confession, look, we're not as bad as Scientology, but our entire church is built around worthiness interviews and temple recommend worthiness. And that's all a confession culture. So we get an A. Maybe Scientologists get the A+, but we still get the A, unfortunately. And I mean the A in a bad way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How could anyone argue with that, really?
I can't. This is just some recommended reading. I have a longer list of recommended reading in my book. These are some great books by authors. My book, Recovering Agency, Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control, which gets specific about Mormonism. And I've distilled a lot of stuff I collected from a lot of other books into this one so that you don't have to read. This shelf behind me, by the way, the top shelf, are all books. Mostly, I've read most of those, and they're all to do with cults and Mormonism and stuff like that. So plug in my book there. And I have resources on my website too for free, recoveringagency.com, blog posts and essays and stuff like that. And then Captive Hearts, Captive Minds. I really love that book. There's a new edition of it called Take Back My Life, which has been updated by Madeline Tobias and Yanya Lalich. Really love that one because it gives like a personal touch and a more of an emotional, empathetic kind of angle. And it also talks to abuse survivors. And Recovery from Cults is a collection of essays and papers by different clinicians in the field, edited by Michael Langoni. They also, by the way, ICSA has a new book, and it's like that thick and it's more academic, and I forget what it's called. It's on one of my shelves around here. So those resources are really good. Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, particularly chapter, it's either 21 or 22. You'd think I would have looked that up by now. And that chapter is actually available free online. You can go check it out. That defines the first 8 mind control techniques and was written in the 60s. And Releasing the Bonds by Stephen Hassan.
I love it. And then there's a big old another reading list of other resources.
And it goes like off the screen.
Yeah.
But the back of my book has a full bibliography, and I have footnotes throughout with all of my sources cited.
So everyone within the sound of my voice or watching now, please buy Luna Lindsey Corbden's book, Recovering Agency. You can get it on Amazon. There's a print version, there's a digital version, there's an audio version. Buy it in all the ways that you can, not just to support Luna, but also to help yourself unpack and deprogram from the harmful things you learned in all the unhealthy organizations or family structures that you were involved with, and to help, it's not a foregone conclusion that you leave a high demand religion or become unorthodox in a high demand religion. And then you're going to have a happy, healthy life and never fall prey again to undue influence. This applies to politics, government, education. This applies to podcasters. This applies to schools. This applies to what else? Other religious traditions, family systems, abusive relationships. This book will help you in all the areas of your life, not just leaving a high demand religion or a cult. So please buy it now. Please support Luna. And and Luna, thanks for another wonderful part 4. We've just got one more to go. Are you exhausted yet?
One left. Not yet. We've been taking nice breaks. About a week in between each one. That's good rest.
And then we'll do that part 5, which will cover the final, let's just say 6-ish of the principles, and then we'll release them all. We'll have Luna Lindsey Corbden Week on Mormon Stories, where we do 5 episodes over 5 days. And we'll answer the question, is the Mormon Church a cult, and or does the Mormon Church engage in cult-like activities? And in a more healthy, constructive sort of way, say, how can we help the Mormon Church be less cult-like or be less harmful to its members? And how can we help, most importantly, how can we help members of the Mormon Church or ex-members of the Mormon Church find healing and growth and unpack all the unhealthy programming or habits or lessons that they learned? I'm going to share a quick comment from Carrie Ann Charette Gardner. So good. Thank you, John and Luna. I just bought your book, Luna, and I can't wait to read it. Thank you, Carrie Ann.
Thank you.
Neil writes, I'm buying it now. Thank you, Neil, for buying the book. Mm-hmm. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and to all the comments and questions. It always makes these episodes more interesting. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for please getting the word out and sharing this with everyone that they can.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on again, John. We'll talk to you about next week or so.
All right, Luna, we'll see you soon.
All right, see ya. Bye.
And listeners, thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories Podcast. We really appreciate it. And we want to thank all our donors that make Mormon Stories Podcast possible. We couldn't do it without your donations, without your support. Unfortunately, we're losing donors and donations every month because people fall on financial hard times, or they lose interest, or they choose to redirect their funds elsewhere. There are lots of reasons why people have to cancel sometimes they just get healthy and move on, and that's all good. So we just want you to know we're losing support all the time. We've got so many expenses that we have, and we need your financial support. Unfortunately, less than 1 out of 1,000 of our listeners or viewers contribute to the podcast. And so we need your help. So if you value this programming, if you want to see it continue, we need you to please become a monthly donor. Go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, $10 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. You will help keep this programming alive. You can pay forward the benefit that you've derived from this program. You can pay it forward to other people in the future, even if you've lost interest. And we're financially transparent. We release our financials every year publicly. We have the best accountant in Utah for nonprofits. We have a solid board to oversee our finances. We have a top-notch staff. And every dollar you pay to the Open Stories Foundation will go towards the mission of supporting people in faith transition, building community, building resources and tools of support. And again, it's all tax deductible in the U.S., so you can deduct it from your taxes. Please support us. Thank you for your support. You can like us. You can recommend us. You can follow us. Become a subscriber on YouTube or a follower on YouTube or on Facebook. Share it on all the social medias. Spread the word. Give us positive reviews wherever you can. All of that stuff helps. Thanks for your support. Thanks to Gerardo. Thanks to Brooklyn. Thanks to Kara. For all the behind the scenes support in the Open Stories Foundation. Thanks to our board, Clint and Carrie. And thanks to all of you, our supporters and listeners and our donors. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com for any feedback or suggestions. Comment on our blog at mormonstories.org. If you need a community of support, go to Facebook, type in Mormon Stories Podcast Community. You can join the Facebook community there and get support. Or in lots of other ways as well. Love you guys. See you soon on Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care. And we'll see you soon for part 5 of this episode with Luna Lindsey Corbden and for other episodes on Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.